There is a children's book series you probably grew up with. You can picture the covers. You can hear the name in your head right now, spelled out exactly the way you have always known it to be spelled. Except it was never spelled that way. Not once. Not in any edition, in any country, in any year the books were printed. The spelling you are completely certain of has never existed anywhere outside of your memory, and the memories of millions of other people who are equally, unshakably certain. This is not a trick. This is not a technicality. This is the Mandela effect, and it is one of the strangest phenomena in the modern study of human memory, perception, and possibly reality itself. It began with a woman who remembered clearly and in detail watching news coverage of Nelson Mandela's death in a prison cell in the 1980s. She remembered the funeral. She remembered his widow's speech. She remembered the world responding to the loss. Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990. He became president of South Africa. He died in 2013. When she shared her memory online, something unexpected happened. Thousands of people responded, not to correct her, but to confirm her. Thousands of strangers from different countries, different ages, different backgrounds, all carrying the same memory of an event that the historical record insists never occurred. What followed was a question that has never been fully answered. Is this simply how memory fails, collectively, consistently, in eerily specific ways, or is there something stranger underneath it? A residue of a reality that once existed differently, a seam between timelines that most people never notice and some people cannot stop feeling. Over 25 chapters, we are going to sit with that question. We are not going to resolve it. The honest answer is that no one can, not yet, and possibly not ever. But we are going to look at it carefully, at the memories that shouldn't match but do, at the science of how recollection actually works, at the physics that leaves just enough room for doubt, at what it means to be a conscious creature whose only access to the past is through a system that rewrites itself every time it remembers. By the end, you may not be sure of everything you thought you knew. That uncertainty, it turns out, is exactly where the most interesting questions live. Chapter 1. The memory that feels more real than the truth. There is something you remember clearly, not something vague or half-formed, not the kind of memory that comes with built-in uncertainty, the kind where you hold it loosely because you know you might be misremembering. This is a clear memory, specific, detailed, the kind that comes with the felt quality of a genuine past experience, rather than a reconstruction or an inference. You remember the color, you remember the context, you remember where you were when you encountered it or learned it or saw it. The memory has the full phenomenological weight of a real thing that happened, a real thing that exists, a real thing that is as it is in your memory, because that is how it was. And then someone shows you the evidence, a photograph, a recording, a physical object, the actual thing you remember, or the thing you thought you remembered, presented to you in a form that cannot be disputed. And the thing is not what you remembered. The detail you are certain about is different. The color is wrong. The word is not there. The image is arranged differently from how you remembered it being arranged. The evidence is clear, and the evidence is inconsistent with your memory. And the memory was completely certain, and the certainty was completely wrong. This experience, which most people have had in some form, and which most people have absorbed as a minor embarrassment and moved past, is the starting point for one of the most genuinely interesting questions in the science of memory. Not interesting because it is mysterious, because in many respects it is not. The mechanisms by which this kind of error occurs are reasonably well understood. What is interesting is the specific quality of the experience, the certainty, the vividness, the felt reality of the memory that was wrong, the way the incorrect memory was indistinguishable from the inside from a correct one. The psychologist Ulrich Neisser documented one of the most instructive examples of this. On the morning after the Challenger space shuttle disaster in January 1986, he asked his students to write down exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. He collected the papers and put them away. 2.5 years later, he asked the same students to write down again where they were and what they were doing when they heard about Challenger. The second accounts differed significantly from the first. When Neisser showed students their original accounts, some refused to believe the papers were in their own handwriting. One student said that the paper must be wrong because she had a very clear memory of what happened, and it was not what the paper described. The paper was not wrong, the student's memory was. but her memory was not experienced as uncertain. The clarity is the thing that requires explanation, and the explanation is not flattering to the ordinary understanding of how memory works. Memory is not a recording. This is the finding that the science of memory has been building toward for several decades, and that still has not fully penetrated the way that most people think and talk about their own recollections. The ordinary model of memory is something like a video recording. The event occurs. The event is encoded in the brain. The encoding is retrieved when the memory is accessed. The retrieval is an approximate replay of the encoding. Memory errors are failures of the recording, failures of the retrieval, noise introduced into a process that is fundamentally a storage and playback system. The scientific model is completely different. Memory is not storage and playback. It is reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you are not retrieving a stored recording. You are rebuilding the memory from fragmentary traces and filling in the gaps with information from other sources, including your general knowledge, your current beliefs and expectations, your emotional state, and the suggestions provided by other people or by subsequent exposure to related material. The rebuilt memory feels like a retrieved recording because the rebuilding process is automatic and is not introspectable. You do not experience the reconstruction, you experience only its product, which has the phenomenological quality of a retrieved original. The reconstruction is usually accurate enough to be practically useful. Most of what most people remember most of the time is close enough to what actually happened that the errors are minor and inconsequential. But the reconstruction is also vulnerable to specific kinds of distortion, and the distortions are not experienced as distortions. The reconstructed memory, whatever its content, feels like the original. The memory of the wrong color feels exactly like the memory of the right color would feel. The memory of the word that was not there feels exactly like the memory of a word that was there would feel. The error is invisible from the inside because there is nothing inside to see it with. The instrument of verification is the instrument that is wrong. The Mandela effect is the name given to a specific variety of this phenomenon, a variety in which the memory error is shared by a large number of people who do not know each other, and who independently report the same incorrect memory. The name comes from the widespread false memory that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s, when in fact he was released in 1990, served as president of South Africa, and died in 2013. Many people remember news coverage of his death in the 1980s. Many people remember the coverage of his funeral. These memories are vivid and specific and entirely false. They are also shared across thousands or millions of people who had no contact with each other and who arrived at the same false memory independently. The sharing is what makes the Mandela effect interesting beyond the ordinary case of individual memory error. Individual memory error is expected and explained. The memory reconstruction process is imperfect, and the imperfections produce errors. The shared false memory is stranger because the errors should be individual, shaped by each person's specific experience and context. When thousands of people share the same specific false memory, the explanation of individual reconstruction error seems insufficient. Something must have caused the same error in so many different people. The explanation, when examined carefully, does not require anything beyond the known mechanisms of memory and the specific features of modern information culture. But the examination requires patience and a willingness to sit with the strangeness before the explanation reduces it. Because the strangeness is real. The certainty that was wrong felt exactly like the certainty that is right. And there is no way from inside a memory to tell the difference. Chapter 2. The Man Who Never Left Prison. There is a memory that many people have. Not a vague impression, not a dim sense of something half recalled from a distant period. A memory with specifics attached to it. The news coverage, the photographs of the funeral, the speeches that were given, the sense of a world pausing to mark the end of something that had been important and contested, and finally, in its ending, resolved into history. The memory is of Nelson Mandela dying in prison. In the 1980s, before he was released, before his presidency, before the long public life that followed his release and that culminated in his actual death in December 2013. People remember the death that did not happen, and they remember it with the specific detail and the specific certainty that genuine memories have. The phenomenon was named for this memory by a writer named Fiona Broome, who encountered it at a science fiction convention in 2009 and then wrote about it online. She had her own memory of Mandela dying in prison and was surprised to discover that others shared it, and more surprised when she began gathering accounts from people across different countries and different backgrounds who had the same false memory. The name caught on. The phenomenon it named had been observed and discussed in various forms before she wrote about it, but she gave it the specific label that became the common reference, and the label pulled the phenomenon into public consciousness in a way that allowed the collection of examples to accelerate. Mandela was born in 1918, studied law, became one of the founding members of the ANC Youth League, was arrested in 1962 and sentenced in 1964 to life imprisonment following the Rivonia trial. He served 27 years, most of them on Robben Island, before being released in February 1990 under F.W. de Klerk's government. He was elected President of South Africa in 1994 in the country's first fully democratic election. He served one term. He continued as a public figure, an elder statesman, a symbol of something that the 20th century found important to have a symbol of for nearly 2 more decades. He died on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95 at his home in Johannesburg. His death was announced by President Jacob Zuma in a televised address. The coverage was extensive. The mourning was global. The funeral was attended by heads of state from around the world. None of this happened before 1990. The prison death that people remembered did not occur. The funeral coverage from the 1980s that people recall did not air. The news broadcasts that are vividly present in specific people's memories were not broadcast. Its falseness is not a matter of interpretation or of uncertain historical record. It is as well documented as any fact in the recent history of public life. Mandela was alive and publicly active until 2013. The memory of his earlier death is wrong, and yet the memory exists in thousands of people with the qualities that genuine memories have. The psychological explanation for why this specific false memory would be shared by so many people is not mysterious once the mechanisms are understood. Several converging factors created conditions in which the same reconstructive error would be made by many different individuals who had no contact with each other. Mandela was imprisoned at a time when the international anti-apartheid movement was a significant political cause in many countries. His imprisonment was the central symbol of the apartheid system's injustice for that movement. He was discussed in those years as a man who might die in prison, as someone whose health was uncertain, as someone whose release seemed unlikely for much of the time he was imprisoned. There were petitions demanding his release, concerts organized in his name, campaigns whose central premise was that a man of this significance was being held in conditions that threatened his life. The cultural conversation around Mandela, for the people engaged with the anti-apartheid movement, was saturated with the possibility of his death in prison. The possibility was discussed constantly. The feared outcome was rehearsed repeatedly. When a feared outcome is rehearsed repeatedly, the rehearsal leaves traces in the memory system that can be difficult to distinguish from traces of actual events. The imagination of an event and the perception of an event engage many of the same neural systems. The mental simulation of Mandela dying in prison, performed many times by many people who feared exactly that outcome, created memorial traces that resembled the traces of actual events. When those people later tried to remember what had actually happened to Mandela, the traces of the imagined deaths were available alongside any genuine memories, and the reconstruction process could draw on the imagined traces as easily as on traces of real events. There were also specific political figures from the same period and the same context who did die before their causes were resolved. Steve Biko died in South African police custody in 1977, a death that received significant international attention. Chris Hani, a prominent ANC leader, was assassinated in 1993. The context of the anti-apartheid struggle was a context that included real deaths of significant political figures, deaths that received international news coverage, deaths that the international anti-apartheid community grieved publicly. The presence of these real deaths in the same contextual category as Mandela created conditions in which the boundaries between remembered deaths could blur, with attributes of the real deaths being attached in reconstruction to the person most prominently associated with the struggle. The specific claim about funeral coverage and news broadcasts is the most puzzling element for people trying to understand the memory without invoking unusual explanations. Not just a general sense that Mandela died, but specific memories of watching the coverage, memories of seeing footage, of hearing commentary, of the specific television watching experience of receiving significant news. These memories are harder to account for by the imagined event mechanism. because imagining something does not typically produce memories of watching television coverage of it. The explanation involves the way that memories of media coverage from a specific period can migrate. The person who watched extensive news coverage of Steve Biko's death, who watched the coverage of other anti-apartheid events, who watched documentaries about Mandela's imprisonment, has a stock of media-related memories from this period and context. In reconstruction, elements of these genuine media memories can be attached to the Mandela death memory, producing a composite that feels like a specific memory of specific coverage, while actually being an assemblage of genuine media memories applied to an imagined event. The experience of the false memory, for the person who has it, is the experience of certainty. They are not uncertain. They are not saying they might be misremembering. They are saying they remember. The memory feels like a memory and not like an imagination. It feels like something that happened and not like something that was feared. The phenomenological quality of the false memory is identical to the phenomenological quality of a genuine one, which is why the discovery that the memory is false can be so disorienting. Mandela left prison in 1990. The memory of him dying there is in thousands of people who watched in their memories coverage that was never broadcast, of a death that never occurred, in a decade that did not contain it, with the full certainty of having been there. Chapter 3. The bear that never had a name. There is a bear. He wears a hat and carries a fishing pole, and appears on the covers of children's books that have been on shelves since 1976. He lives in bear country with his family, and the books that contain him have sold somewhere in the hundreds of millions of copies, and have been read to children in approximately every country where children's books are available in English. The series is among the most commercially successful in the history of children's publishing. The bear is recognizable to an enormous proportion of adults who were children in the decades after the series began. The name of the bear and his family is one of the most familiar things in the memory of a generation. The name, as most people remember it, ends in a double vowel, Berenstain, B-E-R-E-N-S-T-A-I-N, but the name that most people remember is Berenstein, B-E-R-E-N-S-T-E-I-N, with an E before the I-N rather than an A. The Berenstein Bears is what most people would write if asked to spell the name from memory. The Berenstain Bears is what is actually written on every book, every cover, every piece of merchandise, every television episode, every online listing, every record of the series that exists in any verifiable form. The authors were Stan and Jan Berenstain. Their name was always Berenstain. The series was always the Berenstain Bears. The A was always there. The E that people remember was never there. And the number of people who remember the E is remarkable. Not just people who read the books casually and retained a vague impression. People who read the books hundreds of times to their children. People who owned many volumes of the series. People who had the books memorized in the way that parents who have read the same book every night for years develop a memorization that is not chosen, but simply accumulates. These people remember the E with the same certainty that they remember the content of the books, the specific illustrations, the specific jokes, the specific resolutions of the specific stories. The E is not there, it was never there, and it is one of the most widely shared false memories in the catalog of what has come to be called the Mandela effect. The mechanism that produces this specific error is more transparent than many of the false memories in the catalog, which is part of what makes it useful for understanding the phenomenon. The error is driven by pattern recognition and expectation, by the brain's powerful tendency to process incoming information against templates derived from prior experience, and to fill in ambiguous or briefly perceived details with the template-consistent version, rather than attending carefully to what was actually presented. The most common surname ending for Ashkenazi Jewish names in the American context ends in Stein, Weinstein, Frankenstein, Rubenstein, Lichtenstein. The Stein ending is one of the most familiar patterns in a certain category of surname, familiar enough that the brain processes surname-like strings ending in that region with a strong expectation of EIN rather than AIN. When a child encounters the word Berenstain, the word is processed quickly, as words are always processed quickly, and the final syllable is matched to the available template. The template says Stein. The brain files it as Stein. The child has read Berenstein. This happens at the level of reading processing, not at the level of careful attention. Reading is largely an automatic process for fluent readers. The eyes move across text, and the brain extracts meaning without attending carefully to every letter. The familiar pattern is recognized and processed as the familiar pattern, even when the pattern is slightly different from the familiar one. The slightly different pattern is encoded as the familiar one, because the familiar one is what the processing system expected to find and found, in the sense of pattern matching rather than in the sense of careful individual letter recognition. This is not a failure of attention in any blameworthy sense. It is the ordinary operation of a reading system that is optimized for speed and comprehension, rather than for the kind of careful letter-by-letter processing that proofreading requires. Skilled readers read faster, precisely because they are not attending to every letter. They are recognizing patterns. The pattern recognition that makes reading fast also makes it susceptible to exactly this kind of error, where a familiar pattern is recognized in place of a slightly unfamiliar one. The error was then reinforced by repetition. The child who encoded the name as Berenstein encountered the name hundreds of times across the years of their childhood reading, and each encounter reinforced the incorrect encoding rather than correcting it, because each encounter was processed the same way as the first, with the same template producing the same result. The memory was not built once and retained. It was rebuilt each time the name was encountered, and each rebuilding used the same incorrect template, deepening the groove of the incorrect version. The social reinforcement layer adds another dimension. Children discuss the books with other children. Adults discuss them with other adults. The name was spoken aloud in contexts where no one had occasion to check the spelling carefully. The spoken name Berenstein is phonetically similar to Berenstein, and the difference is not pronounced clearly in ordinary speech. The social circulation of the name in its spoken form did not correct the written misremembering, because the spoken form was ambiguous between the two spellings. When people wrote the name, they wrote the version their memory had encoded, which was the E version, and the writing of the E version reinforced the encoding further. The person who encounters the actual spelling as an adult, who discovers for the first time that the A was always there, experiences something that is out of proportion to what the discovery actually is. It is the discovery that a word was spelled differently from how they thought it was spelled. This should be a minor correction, the kind of spelling error that is noted and filed and forgotten. But the experience is often not minor. The experience is often a genuine jolt, a small but real destabilization of something that felt solid. The bear was always there. The books were always there. The memory of the books was always there. And the name in the memory, with its E, is as present and as certain as the memory of the bear's hat, or the fishing pole, or the family living in the treehouse in bear country. The certainty attached to the E is the same certainty attached to all the other details of the memory. The name and the hat and the fishing pole were all encoded by the same system, and are all retrieved by the same system, and feel equally real in retrieval. The hat was always there. The fishing pole was always there. The E was always there, in the memory, which is where it was put, which is not the same as where the A was, which is the book, which is what is real. The bear never had a name that ended in E. The memory of the E is as solid as the memory of the bear, which is why the discovery of the A feels less like a correction and more like a small, specific erasure. Chapter 4. The mirror on the wrong wall. There is a country that most people place in the wrong location. Not by a small margin, not in the way that a rough estimate might be slightly off, in the wrong place in a fundamental sense, mislocated relative to other countries and geographical features, in ways that are significant enough that a map drawn from the collective memory of a large population would show a world that differs meaningfully from the world that exists. New Zealand is placed northwest of Australia by many people who know the region well and have looked at maps of it multiple times. It is southeast of Australia. Sri Lanka is placed south of the southern tip of India by many people. It is southeast of the southern tip and considerably to the east. The Mediterranean has the wrong dimensions. Central America is attached to South America in positions that do not correspond to its actual position. Europe is the wrong size relative to North America. The distortions are not random. This is a different category of Mandela effect from the Berenstain Bears and the prison death, because geography is not a matter of personal experience or cultural exposure in the same way. Most people have not personally visited most of the countries they misremember. Their mental maps of the world are constructed from maps they have seen, from exposure to globes and atlases and online mapping tools, from the kind of repeated low-attention engagement with geographical information that constitutes most people's relationship with the world's layout. The misremembering is not about a product or a person. It is about the shape of the world. The mental map is a cognitive object that psychologists have studied since the 1960s, when the urban planner Kevin Lynch published The Image of the City, documenting the ways that people's internal representations of their own cities differed from the actual spatial arrangements of those cities. Lynch found consistent patterns in the distortions. People's mental maps emphasized certain landmarks and minimized others. They compressed or expanded distances based on the density of memorable features. They simplified curves into straight lines and adjusted angles toward the familiar. The mental map was not a copy of the actual map, but a functional representation optimized for navigation rather than for geometric accuracy. The mental maps that people carry of regions they do not navigate personally are even further from geometric accuracy because they are constructed entirely from representations rather than from embodied experience. When you navigate a city you live in, the mental map is built partly from looking at maps and partly from the proprioceptive experience of moving through the space, which provides direct information about distances and directions. When you form a mental map of a continent you have not visited, the map is built entirely from the representations you have encountered, which are themselves distorted in specific ways. The map projection problem is central to understanding why geographical misremembering is so consistent. The Earth is a sphere, and any flat representation of it involves distortion. Different map projections distort different things. The Mercator projection, which was developed in the 16th century for maritime navigation and which became the dominant projection in Western educational and commercial contexts for several centuries, preserves direction at the cost of distorting area. At high latitudes, areas are dramatically enlarged. Greenland appears roughly the same size as Africa on a Mercator projection. Africa is approximately 14 times larger than Greenland in reality. Europe appears larger relative to Africa than it actually is. North America appears larger relative to South America than it actually is. Canada appears enormous. Antarctica appears as a vast continent-sized strip at the bottom of the map. The mental maps that people in Western educational systems carry are built largely from the Mercator projection or from projections with similar distortions, because those were the maps most commonly encountered in classrooms and textbooks across the 20th century. The distortions of those projections are therefore the distortions of the mental maps. When people misremember the relative sizes of continents, when they overestimate the size of Europe relative to Africa, or the size of North America relative to South America, they are remembering the map they learned from rather than the world the map was representing. The map is in the memory, and the world is not there to correct it. The specific case of New Zealand is interesting because it involves not just size but position. New Zealand appears in the lower right corner of many maps of the Pacific region, positioned relative to Australia in a way that corresponds to its actual southeast position. But New Zealand also frequently appears in an inset or a box in the upper right corner of maps of Australia and the Pacific, placed there because its actual position is inconvenient for the layout of the map, because showing it in its actual position would require either a very large map or wasted space in the lower right. The practice of placing New Zealand in a box in the upper right corner of maps has been common enough that many people's mental maps of the region contain New Zealand in a position that is an artifact of cartographic convenience, rather than of actual geography. The shared nature of geographical misremembering is explained by the shared nature of the source material. People in the same educational system, the same culture, the same era looked at the same maps, the same map projections, the same textbook layouts, the same cartographic conventions produced the same mental maps. The errors are shared because the sources of the errors are shared. The same distorted projections are in the same memory of millions of people who encountered them in the same educational contexts. There is a specific building that many people remember differently from how it exists. The Monopoly board's property locations relative to each other. The layout of childhood homes, reconstructed in memory as slightly different from their actual dimensions. Rooms that were adjacent to rooms they were not adjacent to. Staircases that went the wrong direction. The architecture of remembered spaces is frequently misremembered, and the misremembering often follows specific patterns. Symmetry is imposed on asymmetric layouts. Crowded spaces are expanded. Significant spaces, the spaces where important things happened, are enlarged relative to less significant spaces. The memory optimizes the architecture for the emotional significance of what occurred in it, rather than for its actual geometry. What all of these geographical and architectural misrememberings have in common is that the memory is not attempting to be a faithful recording. It is attempting to be useful. The mental map that distorts in favor of significant landmarks is more useful for navigation than a geometrically accurate map would be. The memory of a building that enlarges the significant rooms is more useful for understanding one's own history than a floor plan would be. The brain is not failing to store accurate information, it is storing functionally adapted information. Information shaped by what mattered rather than by what was. The distortions are features of the adaptation rather than bugs in the recording. New Zealand is southeast of Australia. The memory that places it in the upper right is remembering a box on a map, not a country in the world, and the box was placed there by someone who needed the layout to fit, which it does, in memory, where things fit, the way they were placed. Chapter 5. The line nobody ever said. There is a line from a film that you know. You have heard it quoted. You have possibly quoted it yourself. It exists in the culture with the solidity of a genuine artifact, a specific arrangement of words that has been reproduced in conversation and in print and in countless online exchanges, as an example of what the film contains, what the character said, what the moment was. The line is a real thing. It occupies a specific place in the cultural memory of the people who share it. It is available to be referenced, to be performed with the appropriate accent or intonation, to be recognized by the people around you when you produce it. It is not in the film, not in a different form, not slightly reworded, not paraphrased. The specific words that constitute the memorable line, the version that is in the cultural memory of millions of people, are not in the film. The character does not say them. The scene does not contain them. The film that is playing on the screen, if you watch it, does not have this line in it anywhere. And if you describe the line to someone who has just watched the film carefully, they will tell you that they did not hear it. And they will be right. The most famous example is probably from a film that most people in the English-speaking world have encountered in one form or another. Star Wars. The line that everyone knows from the film, the line that has been quoted for decades, the line that appears on merchandise and in parody and in the conversational shorthand of a culture that absorbed the film as a formative experience, is "Luke, I am your father." The line Darth Vader says in the film is "No, I am your father." The Luke is not there. It was never there. The scene begins with Vader saying "no" and then saying "I am your father." The Luke that is in everyone's memory is an addition that the memory made, not a subtraction that the film made. The reason the addition was made is not mysterious once it is named. Luke is not present in the line as spoken because Vader is responding to Luke's denial and does not need to address him by name at that moment. The scene has a context, and the context makes the omission of the name unnecessary. But the line in isolation, the line extracted from the scene and quoted in conversation, is incomplete without a referent. "Luke, I am your father," tells you everything you need to know about the scene. "No, I am your father" requires that you already know who is speaking and who is being addressed. The cultural transmission of the line stripped it of its context, and the loss of context created a gap that the memory filled with Luke. The Casablanca misquote follows a similar logic. The line that everyone knows is "Play it again, Sam." The line that the film contains is not this. Ingrid Bergman's character says "Play it, Sam" as she is leaving the room. Humphrey Bogart's character later says, "You played it for her? You can play it for me. If she can stand it, I can. Play it." Neither of these is "Play it again, Sam." The "again" is not in either line. The "Sam" is only in the first of the two. The consolidated misquotation packages the emotional content of two separate moments into a single memorable formulation that is more quotable than either original, and captures the scene's emotional logic in a way that the actual dialogue, which is more circuitous and more embedded in context, does not. Sherlock Holmes is remembered as having said, "Elementary, my dear Watson." He does not say this in any of Arthur Conan Doyle's stories. Holmes says "elementary" in some stories, and "my dear Watson" in others, but the combined phrase does not appear in Doyle's writing. It entered the popular imagination through theatrical and film adaptations, where it became a useful shorthand for the character's relationship to deduction and to his companion, and then migrated backward in cultural memory to become a quotation from the original stories. The phrase is now so thoroughly associated with Holmes that it appears in discussions of the original stories as though it belongs there, and the discovery that it does not is the kind of small surprise that people receive with the same mild disorientation as the discovery of the A in Berenstain. Humphrey Bogart's Casablanca character did not say "Here's looking at you, kid," in quite the way it is usually quoted either, though this one is close. Winston Churchill is the source of a number of lines he never said, and is missing from the source of a number of lines he did say, which were later attributed to Mark Twain or to various anonymous wits. Twain himself is the attributed source of an enormous number of lines he did not produce. The saying is now so associated with Twain that new sayings are being attributed to him in the present day, and the attribution migrates backward through time with the same ease that incorrect memories migrate through collective consciousness. The mechanism producing these misquotations is the mechanism of semantic memory versus verbatim memory. Psychological research has consistently shown that the brain does not typically store the exact words of things it encounters. It stores the meaning, the gist, the emotional content, the essential information. When asked to reproduce what was said, the brain reconstructs the verbal form from the stored meaning, and the reconstruction produces a plausible verbal form rather than the original one. The reconstructed form is often more felicitous than the original, more polished, more quotable, more memorable. The memory improves on the original in terms of memorability, which is why the improved version circulates more successfully than the original would have. The social transmission of misquotations follows the same logic as the biological transmission of mutations. The version that is more memorable, more quotable, more satisfying as a summary of the original moment survives the transmission and spreads more widely than a more accurate but less memorable version would. The misquotation is selected for memorability by the process of transmission itself. Each time it is repeated, it is competing with other versions for the limited space in the receiver's memory, and the version that wins the competition is the one that fits the available space best, which is usually the version that is most compact and most emotionally resonant, rather than the version that is most literally accurate. The line in memory is doing the work of cultural shorthand. It is carrying the scene, the character, the moment, the emotional content in a form that is transmissible and recognizable and efficiently packaged. The actual line in the actual film is doing the work of drama. It is embedded in context, dependent on what came before and what comes after, shaped by the rhythm of the scene and the specific character of the performance. These are different jobs, and they require different words, and the words that are best for the drama are not always the words that are best for the cultural memory. The line that nobody ever said is what the scene meant, not what it said, and what it meant turned out to be more memorable than what it said, which is why the saying became what the meaning needed it to be, rather than what the mouth actually produced. Chapter 6. The Brain That Fills the Gaps. There is a blind spot in each of your eyes, not a metaphorical blind spot, not a cognitive limitation applied as a metaphor to visual perception. A literal physical absence of photoreceptors at the point where the optic nerve connects to the retina. At this point, there are no rods and no cones and no ability to detect light at all. The blind spot in each eye covers a region of the visual field that is not small. If you hold your thumb at arm's length and look at it, the blind spot is roughly the size of your thumbnail at that distance. You have been carrying this absence since birth, and you have almost certainly never noticed it, because you have never noticed the absence of information at that location in your visual field. What you experience instead is a continuous visual field with no gap, no hole, no region that feels like missing information. The brain filled the gap. The brain has been filling the gap your entire life, seamlessly, automatically, without announcing itself, producing an experience of continuous vision where the underlying apparatus has a significant hole. This is not a flaw that the brain is compensating for. It is the ordinary operation of a perceptual system that was built for function rather than for accuracy. The brain does not receive complete sensory data and then report it faithfully. It receives partial, ambiguous, often contradictory sensory data and then constructs a coherent experience from it, using prior knowledge, expectation, context, and inference to fill in the gaps and resolve the ambiguities. The experience you have of seeing the world is not the world. It is the brain's best construction of the world given the available data. The construction is usually good enough to navigate by. It is not a recording. Memory works the same way, and the parallel is not accidental. Both perception and memory are constructive processes. Both involve the brain taking partial data and completing it using prior knowledge and expectation. The difference is in the timescale. Perception constructs the present in real time. Memory reconstructs the past when retrieval is attempted. Both processes introduce the same fundamental possibility of error, the possibility that the construction or reconstruction does not match the original information, that the completed picture differs from what was actually there, in ways that the person doing the experiencing cannot detect. The psychologist Frederick Bartlett established the reconstructive nature of memory in the 1930s through a series of experiments that have become foundational to the field. His most famous experiment used a Native American folktale called The War of the Ghosts. He had English participants read the story and then recall it at various intervals after reading. The story was culturally unfamiliar to the participants, with elements that did not fit their existing schemas for what stories contained and how they were structured. In recalling the story, participants consistently transformed it. Unfamiliar elements were replaced with familiar ones. The causal structure was rationalized into something more consistent with European narrative expectations. The length was reduced. The strange was normalized. The story that participants recalled bore a systematic relationship to the story they had read, but it was not the story they had read. It was a reconstruction shaped by what they already knew and expected stories to be. Bartlett's central concept was the schema, a mental structure built from prior experience that organizes and shapes the interpretation of new information. When new information is encoded, it is encoded in relation to existing schemas. The encoding is not neutral. It is shaped by what the schema expects the information to be. When the information is later retrieved, the reconstruction is shaped by the same schema, which fills in gaps left by the imperfect encoding with schema-consistent material. The reconstructed memory is a collaboration between what was actually experienced and what the schema expects the experience to have been. When the two are consistent, the reconstruction is accurate. When they diverge, the reconstruction tends toward the schema, at the expense of accuracy. The schema that shapes memory reconstruction is not static. It is updated by subsequent experience, including by other memories and by information received after the original encoding. This is why eyewitness memory is so susceptible to post-event information. The person who witnesses an event and then hears other people's accounts of the event, or reads news coverage of it, or is interviewed by someone who asks leading questions, is exposing their memory of the event to information that can be incorporated into the schema and then incorporated into subsequent reconstructions. The memory does not have a timestamp that marks which information came from the original event and which came afterward. All the information is in the schema, and all of it is available for reconstruction, regardless of when it arrived. Elizabeth Loftus spent decades documenting this process in research that has transformed the legal understanding of eyewitness testimony. Her most famous early demonstration involved showing participants a film of a traffic accident, and then asking them questions about it using different verbs. Participants who were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other gave higher speed estimates than participants who were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Participants who had been asked the smashed question were more likely to report having seen broken glass in the film than participants who had been asked the hit question. There was no broken glass in the film. The word smashed had modified the schema, and the modified schema had produced a false detail in the subsequent reconstruction. Loftus went on to demonstrate that entirely false memories could be implanted through suggestion, that participants could be led to believe they had experienced childhood events that had not occurred, that the false memories were experienced with the same felt reality as genuine memories, and that the participants who had been given false memories could not reliably distinguish their false memories from their genuine ones. The implantation did not require deception or coercion. It required only suggestion in a context of trust, the same context in which people ordinarily receive information about the past from family members, friends, and institutions they regard as reliable. The specific relevance of all this to the Mandela effect is direct. The Mandela effect is not a collection of anomalies that require unusual explanations. It is a collection of examples of the ordinary operation of reconstructive memory, scaled up by the shared cultural environment that provides the same schemas to large numbers of people, and made visible by the specific conditions of the modern information environment that allow large numbers of people to discover and compare their false memories simultaneously. The brain that fills the gaps in vision fills the gaps in memory using the same tools: prior knowledge, expectation, schema, context. The filling is automatic. The filled version feels like the original. The gap is invisible because the filling has replaced it. The Ian Berenstain, the Luke Invaders revelation, the death of a man who would live for decades more. These are all gaps filled by schemas that expected something specific, and the expectation produced the filling, and the filling feels like the fact. The blind spot is still there. You are still not seeing it. The brain filled it. the moment you looked, and every moment before that, since you first opened your eyes. Chapter 7. The consensus that shouldn't exist. There is a difference between being wrong and being wrong in exactly the same way as 10,000 other people who never spoke to each other. The first is ordinary, the second requires an explanation. Memory errors are expected, and they are individual. The reconstruction process that produces false memories is sensitive to individual experience, to the specific schemas built by specific exposure to specific material across a specific life. Two people who read the same book in different contexts, at different ages, with different prior knowledge, will reconstruct different errors when they later try to remember the book's contents. The errors are personal. They reflect the individual's particular cognitive history. They are not shared in any systematic way with the errors of other readers who brought different histories to the same text. This is what makes the Mandela effect a distinct phenomenon, rather than simply a collection of anecdotes about individual memory failures. The errors cluster. The same error appears in large numbers of people who have no evident connection to each other, who are in different countries and different demographic groups and different cultural contexts, and who independently report the same specific false memory with the same specific false details. They do not remember vaguely that Mandela might have died in prison. They remember specific details of a specific death that did not occur. They do not have a general sense that the Berenstain name might end differently. They remember a specific E that was never there. The errors are not diffuse. They are precise, and they are shared. The question of why this should be so is the central question of the Mandela effect as a phenomenon, and the answer is not obvious from the cases themselves. Several mechanisms contribute, and understanding how they interact helps explain why the clustering exists without requiring any unusual account of how memory works. The first mechanism is the shared information environment. The people who share a Mandela effect memory were exposed to the same or similar source material in the same or similar contexts. They read the same books, watched the same films, attended the same schools, encountered the same media landscape. The source material passed through the same channels and was presented in the same format, and was surrounded by the same cultural context. The schemas they brought to the material were shaped by the same cultural background. When multiple people process the same source material through similar schemas and similar contexts, the reconstruction errors they make are constrained to be similar by the similarity of the inputs. The individual variance in reconstruction is real, but it operates within a range that the shared inputs have defined. The shared false memory is the attractor state within that range. The second mechanism is cultural transmission. The Mandela effect memory is not only formed when the source material is first encountered, it is reinforced, modified, and in some cases, initially formed through the cultural transmission of what other people say about the source material. When people talk about the Berenstain Bears, they say Berenstain using the pronunciation that fits their mental encoding, which for most people is the E version. When other people hear the name spoken this way and look up the books or think about them, they form or reinforce an encoding that is consistent with the spoken version they heard. The cultural transmission of the misremembering reinforces the misremembering in the people who receive it, and they in turn transmit the reinforced version to others. The third mechanism is schema convergence. Human beings in similar cultural environments develop similar schemas. The schemas are not identical, but they share certain features that are determined by the shared features of the cultural environment. The schema that expects surnames in the relevant context to end in Stein rather than Stain is not an idiosyncratic personal schema. It is a schema that anyone who grew up in a certain cultural context, who encountered names of a certain type with a certain frequency, would develop. The convergent schemas produce convergent errors when they are applied to the same ambiguous material. The fourth mechanism is the specific vulnerability of the source material to the shared error. Not all material is equally vulnerable to Mandela effect misremembering. The cases that produce large-scale shared false memories tend to have specific properties. The material was encountered repeatedly, but not carefully. The source material had a specific feature that was ambiguous or that differed from what the schema expected. The cultural context provided strong expectations that the material did not satisfy. The gap between the expectation and the reality was small enough that the schema filled it automatically without triggering careful attention. These properties are not specific to any individual. They are properties of the material relative to the schemas that any person from the relevant cultural background would bring to it. When the material has these properties, the error is produced in anyone who processes it through the relevant schema, and the resulting false memory is shared by everyone who processed it the same way. The fifth mechanism, which became dramatically more important with the rise of the internet, is the aggregation of individual false memories into visible collective phenomena. Before the internet, people who had the false memory of Mandela's death did not know that other people had the same false memory. The memory was individual and unconfirmed, and provided no particular evidence of its own unusual nature. With the internet, people could discover that their false memory was shared, could find thousands of others reporting the same memory, could compare specific details and find that the details matched. The discovery of the shared false memory became possible in a way it had not been before, and the discovery transformed how the phenomenon was understood by the people who had the memories. Instead of an individual error, it became a collective one, and the collective nature seemed to demand explanation beyond what individual memory failure could provide. The demand for additional explanation is understandable, but not necessarily justified. The collective nature of the Mandela effect is striking, but it is a consequence of the mechanisms described above, rather than evidence that those mechanisms are insufficient. Shared source material, shared schemas, cultural transmission of errors, and the specific vulnerability of certain material to certain errors are all individually mundane features of how memory and culture work. Their combination produces shared false memories without requiring anything beyond them. The clustering is expected given the inputs. The inputs were shared, so the errors are shared. The internet made the sharing of the errors visible. The visibility makes them seem more mysterious than they are. The consensus that should not exist does exist, but it exists for reasons that exist. Shared environment, shared schemas, shared source material with specific vulnerabilities, and a new technology that allowed the shared errors to find each other for the first time. Chapter 8. The childhood that was slightly different. There is a product from childhood that you remember clearly. The packaging had a specific color, or a specific mascot, or a specific arrangement of text. You consumed it, or played with it, or watched it, or wore it, at an age when the world was being absorbed at a rate that it is never absorbed again, before the filters were fully built, before the schemas were fully formed, when the impression made by everything that entered through the senses was deep and seemingly permanent. The product is associated with the specific texture of being young, of being in a particular house, in a particular season, of being the age you were when the world was still mostly a place of first encounters. The memory of the product is not separate from the memory of being a child. It is woven into it. And the product, when you encounter it again as an adult, or encounter records of it in the form of archived packaging or childhood photographs or old advertising, is not what you remembered. The color is different. The mascot has a different expression or a slightly different design. The text is arranged differently. The name is spelled differently. The product exists in the archive as something that was continuous with your life, that occupied the same period, that was presumably the same product you are remembering, and yet the archived version and the remembered version are not identical. This experience is so common that it constitutes its own category of Mandela effect, distinct from the cases involving public figures or famous films or major historical events. The childhood product misremembering has a specific emotional register that the other cases do not have, because it involves not just a factual error, but a disturbance of something more intimate. The memory of the product is the memory of childhood. The product, as remembered, is woven into the felt experience of being young. When the product turns out to have been slightly different, the disturbance is not just to a fact. It is to the texture of a period of life. The Monopoly Man is one of the most discussed examples in this category. Mr. Monopoly, the character on the Monopoly board and its packaging, is widely remembered as wearing a monocle, a single lens held in one eye without a frame, the classic symbol of a certain kind of excessive wealth that the character was designed to embody. The memory of the monocle is specific and confident. People who played Monopoly dozens of times across childhood are certain of the monocle. People who can describe other details of the character's appearance with accuracy are certain of the monocle. The monocle is in the memory with the same certainty as the top hat and the white hair and the prosperous demeanor. Mr. Monopoly has never worn a monocle. Every version of the character across the game's history wears a top hat and carries a cane and has white hair and a mustache. No monocle. The monocle that is so clearly in so many people's memories of the character has never been on the character, in any printing of the game, in any version of the character's design, at any point in the history of the game. The explanation for the monocle involves the same schema mechanism that explains the other cases, but the specific schema here is the archetype of the wealthy capitalist figure, which in the cultural imagination does include the monocle. The Monopoly Man belongs to a type, and the type includes the monocle as one of its defining features. Rich Uncle Pennybags, as the character is formally named, is a caricature of Gilded Age plutocracy, and the visual vocabulary of that caricature in the cultural imagination includes the monocle alongside the top hat and the frock coat and the waxed mustache. When people encounter the character, they process him through the schema of the type, and the schema includes the monocle, and the monocle enters the memory even though it was not in the image. The Febreze versus Febreze case involves a different mechanism. Febreze, the air freshener product, is remembered by a substantial number of people as Febreze with an additional E. The product name is Febreze. The added E is a phonological expectation error. The word Febreze violates a pattern that English words usually follow. A word pronounced as two syllables, with the second syllable rhyming with breeze, would typically be spelled with a double vowel or a silent E in the relevant position. Febreze is spelled in a way that suggests a pronunciation that does not match the actual pronunciation, and the memory corrects for this by adding the E that would make the spelling consistent with the pronunciation. The error is not a failure to remember a fact. It is the application of a rule that the word violated. The Looney Tunes versus Looney Tunes case follows the same logic. Most people remember the animated series as Looney Tunes. The actual name is Looney Tunes. The Tunes spelling is a wordplay on the word tunes, consistent with the musical origins of the format, which began as short films accompanying musical performances in theaters. The Tunes spelling would be the obvious spelling for a word derived from cartoons. People misremember tunes as tunes because the Tunes spelling is the one their schema for animation-related words would produce. The Tunes spelling is a pun that requires knowing the history, and many people do not know the history, and their memory supplied the spelling that the word would have if the history were not relevant. The fruit of a particular brand of candy, or the design of a toy that was ubiquitous in a specific decade, or the character on the packaging of a cereal that no longer exists. These objects exist in memory in versions that have been shaped by what they were expected to be, by the schemas that process them in the first encounter and in every subsequent encounter, by the cultural transmission of descriptions and references, by the specific conditions under which they were encoded, which were the conditions of childhood, when the world was being absorbed quickly and without the careful attention that would be required to produce accurate long-term storage. Childhood is a time when schemas are forming, rather than formed. The schemas that would allow accurate encoding of new information are being built from the information being encountered. When the schemas are incomplete, the gaps in the schema are filled differently from how they would be filled by a more complete schema. The childhood memories that feel most solid and most certain are often the ones that were most thoroughly processed by the emerging schema, which means they are the ones that were most thoroughly shaped by expectation and prior knowledge. The memory is not of what was there, it is of what the emerging schema understood to be there. The childhood that was slightly different is the childhood that the forming mind made sense of, using the tools it had, which were not yet complete, and filled the gaps with what it expected, which is all any mind can fill them with. Chapter 9. The timeline that slipped. There is a version of the explanation for the Mandela effect that is not the explanation that the psychologists offer, and that is not the explanation that most people who study memory professionally would endorse. It is nevertheless the explanation that many of the people who have the false memories find most compelling, most satisfying, most adequate to the specific quality of their experience. The explanation is that the memories are not false. The memories are accurate records of a reality that no longer exists. A version of the world in which Mandela did die in prison, in which the Berenstain Bears were the Berenstain Bears, in which the Monopoly Man wore his monocle. The world changed. The memories of the previous world remained. The mismatch between the memories and the current state of the world is not a product of faulty reconstruction. It is a product of accurate reconstruction of a reality that was replaced. The specific form this explanation usually takes draws on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which was discussed in the time travel series. In the many worlds interpretation, every quantum event produces a branching of the wave function in which all possible outcomes occur in separate branches. The universe is not a single timeline, but an enormous and continually expanding tree of branching timelines, each internally consistent, each real, each populated by observers who experience their branch as the only reality. The timeline slip version of the Mandela effect proposes that some mechanism, usually unspecified, causes jumps between these branches, and that the people who share a Mandela effect memory are people who have shifted from one branch to another, carrying their memories from the previous branch into the current one. The appeal of this explanation is not difficult to understand. The felt quality of the false memory, the specific certainty and vividness that were described in the first chapter of this series, is better captured by the explanation that the memory is of something real than by the explanation that the memory is a reconstruction error. The person whose memory of the E in Berenstain feels absolutely genuine is told by the psychologist that the feeling of genuineness is not reliable, that reconstructed false memories feel exactly like genuine memories, that the certainty is not evidence. The timeline slip explanation tells the same person that their feeling is accurate, that the memory is genuine, that the E was there in the world they came from. The explanation validates the experience rather than explaining it away. This validation is significant and should not be dismissed as mere emotional preference. The phenomenological problem with the memory error explanation is real if false memories are phenomenologically identical to genuine memories. If there is no felt difference between a reconstruction error and an accurate recall, then the subjective experience of certainty is not just occasionally misleading. It is systematically uninformative about its own accuracy. The experience that feels most like genuine memory, the experience with the highest subjective confidence, is indistinguishable from the experience of a well-constructed false memory. This creates a genuine epistemological problem for anyone trying to evaluate their own memories. The tool you would use to distinguish accurate from inaccurate memory, the subjective sense of certainty, is itself unreliable in exactly the cases where reliability is most needed. The timeline slip explanation sidesteps this problem by accepting the subjective certainty as evidence. If the memory feels real, the explanation says, it is because it is real, a real memory of a real world that was real until something changed. The epistemological problem dissolves because the problem was not with the memory but with the world. The world changed, the memory did not. The empirical problems with the timeline slip explanation are significant, but they are worth stating carefully rather than dismissively. The first problem is that the proposed mechanism is unspecified. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics does not include, within its actual content, any mechanism for observers to move between branches. In the many worlds interpretation, branches are causally isolated from each other after the point of branching. An observer in one branch cannot detect, communicate with, or travel to another branch. The branching is irreversible and the isolation is complete. The Mandela effect theory borrows the vocabulary of the many worlds interpretation without the actual content, using the existence of multiple branches as a backdrop, while ignoring the feature of the interpretation that makes branch crossing impossible. The second problem is that the timeline slip explanation predicts more than it can account for. If people's memories of the previous timeline are accurate, then the previous timeline contained all the details that are in those memories, including all the details that are consistent with the current timeline. The people who remember the Berenstain Bears as the Berenstain Bears remember all the other details of the books as they actually are in the current timeline. The stories are the same, the characters are the same, the illustrations are the same, only the spelling of the name is different. The timeline that was supposedly replaced was identical to the current one, in every respect except the specific details that are Mandela effects. This is an extraordinarily precise and targeted change, one that affected only the specific features that people now misremember and nothing else. The specificity of the change is more consistent with a reconstruction error that affects specific features than with a timeline replacement that would presumably affect many more things. The third problem is that the timeline slip explanation does not connect to any known physics in the way that would be required for it to be taken seriously as a scientific proposal. The many worlds interpretation is a serious interpretation of quantum mechanics, endorsed by many working physicists. But the application of it that the Mandela effect theory requires is not entailed by the interpretation itself, and is not supported by any extension of it that has been developed. The vocabulary is borrowed from a real theory, but the mechanism is not derived from it. The explanation is using the prestige of quantum mechanics as a legitimizing context, without making a quantum mechanical claim. What the timeline slip explanation does well is name the phenomenological experience. The person who has a Mandela effect memory does have the experience of a memory that conflicts with the current state of the world. The experience is of a world that was different. Whether that experience is produced by accurate memory of a different world, or by inaccurate reconstruction of this world, produces the same experience, because accurate memory and inaccurate reconstruction are phenomenologically identical, which is the problem the explanation was trying to solve. The theory that the timeline slipped is the theory that the memories are telling the truth about what the world was, rather than what the mind reconstructed it to be. It is the theory that takes the experience at face value, and there is something in that, something about the insistence on taking experience seriously, that is not entirely without value, even if the specific mechanism proposed does not hold up to examination. The memory says the world was different. The records say the memory is wrong, and the question of which one to trust is not as simple as it sounds. Chapter 10. The Physicist's Uncomfortable Silence. There is a moment in conversations about the Mandela effect when the quantum mechanics is invoked and the physicist, if one is present, goes quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of someone who is being politely dismissive. Not the quiet of someone who finds the conversation beneath their attention. The quiet of someone who is deciding how to be honest about something complicated. The honest answer is not a simple no, but it is also not the answer that the person invoking quantum mechanics is hoping for. The honest answer requires making several distinctions that collapse the hope without simply dismissing the question. The first distinction is between what the many worlds interpretation says and what the Mandela effect theory needs it to say. The many worlds interpretation, developed by Hugh Everett in 1957 and taken seriously by a significant number of physicists today, proposes that the universal wave function never collapses. In the standard Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, measurement causes the wave function to collapse from a superposition of possible states into a single definite state. The randomness of quantum mechanics is fundamental on this view. In Everett's interpretation, the wave function does not collapse. It continues to evolve according to the Schrödinger equation, which is deterministic. What appears to be a collapse, what appears to be the selection of one outcome from among many possible outcomes, is actually the entanglement of the measuring apparatus and the observer with the quantum system, producing a superposition of the whole system in which each possible outcome occurs in a separate branch. On the many worlds interpretation, all of these branches are equally real. The branch in which the measurement gave result A and the branch in which it gave result B both exist. The observer in branch A did not observe the observer in branch B, because the branches are causally isolated from each other. After the branching, no interaction is possible between the branches. The information in one branch cannot reach the information in another. The observer in branch A cannot detect the existence of branch B. The observer in branch A cannot travel to branch B. The observer in branch A cannot receive memories from branch B. The branches are real and they are separate, and the separation is as complete as any separation in physics. This is the point at which the Mandela effect theory and the many worlds interpretation part company, and the parting is not a minor disagreement about details. The entire content of the Mandela effect theory, as it invokes quantum mechanics, is that memories from one branch persist into another branch. The entire content of the many worlds interpretation, as it actually says, is that this is not possible. The branches are isolated. The isolation is the mechanism by which the appearance of wave function collapse is produced. Without the isolation, the interference between branches would be detectable, and if the interference were detectable, the many worlds interpretation would make different predictions from the Copenhagen interpretation, and experiments could distinguish between them. The isolation is not a peripheral feature. It is the feature that makes the interpretation consistent with observation. The second distinction is between quantum effects and macroscopic phenomena. Quantum effects are real and are thoroughly verified experimentally. The superposition of quantum states, the entanglement of particles, the tunneling of particles through barriers, these are phenomena that exist and that have been confirmed to extraordinary precision. But quantum effects operate at scales where quantum mechanics is the relevant physics. which is the scale of individual particles and systems of small numbers of particles. At the macroscopic scale, at the scale of human beings and their memories, and the books on their shelves, and the products in their pantries, quantum effects are not the relevant physics. The behavior of macroscopic systems is governed by classical physics, which is the limit of quantum physics when the relevant quantities are large. The individual neurons in a human brain may be subject to quantum effects, but the firing of those neurons and the formation of memories is a macroscopic phenomenon that classical neuroscience describes adequately. The many worlds interpretation's branches diverge at the quantum scale, and the divergence propagates through decoherence into the macroscopic scale, producing branches that differ at the macroscopic level. But the divergence between branches at the macroscopic level is the product of quantum events at the microscopic level, and the scale of the divergence is limited by the scale of the quantum event. The quantum event that produces a branching is not, in general, the kind of event that changes the spelling of a word in a children's book or the presence or absence of a monocle on a cartoon character. The quantum events that produce branchings are events like the radioactive decay of a single nucleus or the absorption of a single photon by a single atom. The macroscopic consequences of these events are usually negligible, and when they are not negligible, they are not the kind of targeted, specific, culturally meaningful consequences that the Mandela effect theory requires. The third distinction is between the many worlds interpretation as a description of what exists and any mechanism for interaction between branches. The many worlds interpretation says that multiple branches exist. It does not say anything about how an observer could move between branches or how memories from one branch could persist into another. These are not implications of the interpretation. They are additions to the interpretation that are not grounded in the physics. The interpretation describes the structure of the wave function. It does not describe the experiences of observers within that structure in a way that would support the crossing of branches or the persistence of memories across branch boundaries. The uncomfortable silence of the physicist is the silence of someone who knows that quantum mechanics is being invoked as a legitimizing framework for a claim that the physics does not support, and who is trying to find a way to be honest about this without seeming to be closing down a genuinely interesting question. The question of whether multiple realities exist is a genuinely interesting question that the many worlds interpretation engages with seriously. The question of whether memories from one reality could persist into another is a question that the interpretation does not engage with at all, because the interpretation does not include any mechanism for such persistence, and the mechanisms that would be required for it are not consistent with the isolation of branches that is central to the interpretation. What the physicist can say, honestly and without dismissiveness, is that quantum mechanics is strange, and that our ordinary intuitions about reality are not reliable guides to what physics actually says. What the physicist cannot say is that the many worlds interpretation supports the timeline slip theory of the Mandela effect. The silence is the silence of this gap, the gap between what quantum mechanics actually says and what the Mandela effect theory needs it to say, which the physicist finds difficult to bridge with words that are both accurate and not deflating. The strangeness of quantum mechanics is real. The many worlds are real, on the interpretation that includes them. The isolation of those worlds is also real, and the silence is the space between the strangeness that exists and the strangeness that would be needed for the memories to have come from somewhere else. Chapter 11. The interview nobody can find. There is a memory of watching something on television, not a vague impression, not the general sense that something was broadcast at some point. A specific memory. The program, the host, the setting, the approximate time of day, or the specific context of the viewing, the room you were in, the circumstances that put you in front of the screen at that moment. You watched an interview, or a news segment, or a clip that circulated in the days when clips circulated differently than they do now, passed from person to person by description rather than by link. And the memory of watching it is as specific as any memory you have of watching television. The memory is detailed enough that you can describe what was said. Not word for word, perhaps, but the substance, the content, the thing that made the segment memorable, the thing that distinguished it from the ordinary flow of broadcast content and made it something worth retaining. You have retained it. You retained it without deciding to retain it, in the way that things which are sufficiently interesting or surprising or emotionally resonant are retained without effort, simply by the weight of the impression they made. And then someone tries to find the recording, not someone skeptical of the memory, not someone trying to prove you wrong, but someone curious, someone who wants to see the thing you described, who has the tools to look for it in the archives where broadcast content is stored. And the recording is not there, not in the obvious places, not in the less obvious places, not after an extended search through the archives that exist, not after appeals to people who specialize in finding exactly this kind of thing. The recording does not appear. The segment you watched, the interview you remember, the clip that you can describe in specific detail is not in any accessible archive. This is a specific and interesting category of Mandela effect, because it involves not just the misremembering of a detail about something that definitely exists, but the memory of something that apparently does not exist in any recoverable form. The Berenstain Bears books exist and can be examined. The Monopoly game exists and can be examined. The film exists, and the line that was or was not in it can be verified by watching the film. The television segment, the broadcast interview, the news clip, exists only in the memories of the people who remember watching it and not in any archive that preserves the thing itself. The most commonly cited example in this category involves an interview that many people remember seeing with the actor Sinbad, in which he played or discussed a genie character, in a context that most people who remember it associate with a film called Shazam, that Sinbad made in the 1990s. The film Shazam does not exist in any archive, on any media, in any format. There is no record of its production, no cast or crew who recall making it, no advertisement, no review, no listing in any film database, no studio record. The film that many people remember watching does not appear to have ever existed as a film. What does exist is a film called Kazam, released in 1996, in which the rapper Shaquille O'Neal plays a genie. Sinbad hosted a Sinbad's Lair marathon on the Sci-Fi Channel on the same day, in the same year, dressed in a colorful costume that was not a genie costume, but that contained some visual elements that might, under conditions of imperfect attention, be associated with such a costume. The proximity of these two things in cultural memory, the Kazam film featuring a genie and the Sinbad program in a visually distinctive costume, created conditions in which the two could be conflated in reconstruction, producing a memory of a Sinbad genie film that draws on elements of both. The mechanism of source confusion is the psychological term for what happens when the brain correctly stores information, but incorrectly stores information about where the information came from. The content of a memory can be accurate or approximately accurate, while the source attribution is wrong. The person who remembers the genie film may accurately remember several elements that came from real sources: the genie character from Kazam, the appearance of Sinbad in the same general period in a visually distinctive context, the association between Sinbad as a performer and the genie character from the Sinbad of ancient stories, which is an association that the performer's name actively invites. The reconstruction combines these elements with the source attribution that the name association suggests, producing a memory of a Sinbad genie film that feels as specific as a memory of a film that was actually watched. The absence of the archive record does not disprove that something was broadcast. Broadcast archives are not complete. The history of television includes an enormous amount of content that was never preserved, because the technology of preservation and the institutional will to preserve were not always present simultaneously. Live broadcasts were not recorded. Recorded broadcasts were tapped over. The tape of a live broadcast exists in a single copy, and that copy is damaged or lost. The program existed in the moment of broadcast, and then existed only in the memories of the people who watched it. The archive has significant gaps, and the gaps are not uniformly distributed across time or across types of content. Local broadcasts, live broadcasts, niche programming, content from the early decades of television. These are the areas where the gaps are largest. The specific memory of the interview that cannot be found exists in a space of genuine uncertainty. It may be a reconstructed false memory, a source confusion in which elements from different genuine memories were combined under an incorrect source attribution. It may be a genuine memory of something that was broadcast and not preserved, something that existed and then ceased to exist in any accessible form. The inability to find the archive record does not distinguish between these possibilities. What the experience of trying to find the archive record produces, and failing to find it, is a specific and interesting form of epistemic discomfort. The memory is present and specific. The record is absent. The ordinary way of resolving the question, the way of checking the record against the memory, is not available. The person with the memory is left holding a specific and confident recollection, of something that the available evidence cannot confirm and does not disprove. The uncertainty is unresolvable from the evidence currently at hand. The television that broadcasts the thing you remember is still broadcasting. Something is always on, but the specific thing, the one you watched, is either in an archive that has not been found, or in a memory that assembled it from things that were adjacent to the thing it became. Chapter 12. The death that happened twice. There is a specific kind of cognitive disorientation that happens when a person you believe to be dead appears on your screen. Not a figure from a film, not a character in a story. A real person, alive, speaking, doing whatever living people do when they are interviewed or photographed or otherwise captured in the ongoing record of their existence. The disorientation is specific because it is not surprise exactly. Surprise at someone's appearance on a screen is a familiar experience. This is something more intimate than surprise. It is the experience of a contradiction between a belief held with the quiet certainty of an established fact, and the evidence in front of you that the fact is wrong. The person you believe to be dead is not dead. The belief was wrong, and the belief was not uncertain. It was settled. The deaths that happened before they happened are a specific subset of the Mandela effect, with a specific structure that distinguishes them from the cases involving product names or film quotes. They involve not just a misremembered detail, but a misremembered event, a major event. The kind of event that is processed emotionally and socially in ways that encode it deeply in memory. The death of a public figure is news. It produces news coverage. It produces social conversation. It produces an emotional response in the people for whom the figure was significant, that gives the event a weight in memory beyond what most information receives. When a death is misremembered, the misremembering carries that emotional weight. The person has been mourned. The grief, however brief and however secondary, was real. The processing of the loss, however partial, happened. And then the person appears, alive, and the processing must be undone, and the fact must be revised, and the certainty must accommodate the correction. Nelson Mandela is the foundational case and has been discussed in this series already, but the phenomenon is not unique to him. Billy Graham, the evangelical preacher, was widely believed by a number of people to have died before he actually died in February 2018. People remember the coverage of his death, the tributes, the retrospectives on his life and work. The specific memories are vivid enough that when Graham died in reality, some people who had these memories encountered the coverage of his actual death with the feeling that they were seeing something they had already seen. The death was happening twice, in their experience, once in a past that the records do not confirm, and once in a present that the records do confirm. Henry Winkler, the actor known for his role as Fonzie in Happy Days, has been cited by people as someone they believed had died before he was actually living and working, whose death was predicted and prematurely announced so many times during his life that it became a running commentary on the difficulty of his actual mortality, is another figure around whom the premature death memory clusters. Castro did die in November 2016, after decades of rumors and predictions, and at least one U.S. government operation premised on the expectation of his death. The long history of premature death reports, the sustained cultural attention to the question of when he would die, created conditions in which false memories of his death could form in people who were attending to that cultural conversation without closely tracking the specific dates and outcomes of specific reports. The mechanism that produces the premature death memory is in many cases different from the mechanism that produces the simpler detail misrememberings. The premature death memory often has a specific origin in a genuine report or rumor that did not reach the person as a rumor, but reached them as a fact. The person heard that the figure had died from a source that seemed credible, in a context that did not trigger skepticism, and encoded the death as a fact. The subsequent correction either did not reach them or did not register with sufficient force to dislodge the encoding. The memory of the death remained, while the memory of the correction faded, or the correction was never received. This process is accelerated and complicated by the specific conditions of news consumption in the digital era. The news environment produces a high volume of information, much of it preliminary or inaccurate, that is consumed quickly and without careful attention to sourcing or to the subsequent corrections that often follow preliminary reports. The rapid initial dissemination of an incorrect report and the slower, less prominent dissemination of the correction mean that the incorrect report reaches a larger audience and is more deeply encoded in more people. The correction reaches a smaller audience, arrives in a lower attention context, and is encoded less deeply. The ratio of incorrect encoding to correct encoding can be unfavorable to accuracy, even in people who are generally well-informed and who believe they follow the news carefully. The emotional weight of the death specifically makes the initial incorrect encoding more durable. The person who received the report of the death and processed it emotionally, who felt the specific response that a public figure's death produces in people for whom the figure was significant, encoded the death more deeply than they would have encoded a neutral piece of information. The emotional processing strengthens encoding. When the correction arrived, it arrived without the emotional processing, as a factual update rather than an emotional event. The fact that the correction arrived later and without the emotional weight means that the correction is more weakly encoded than the original report, and the original report has an advantage in the competition between them for what the memory retains as accurate. The death that happened twice, for the person who experiences it, has a specific phenomenological quality that is worth noting. When the figure appears alive, after the death has been believed and processed, the experience is not simply the experience of learning that a fact was wrong. It is the experience of a world in which something that was complete and settled is suddenly incomplete and unsettled. The death was an event. Events are bounded in time. They happen, and then they are over, and they recede into the past where they are fixed. When the event is revealed to have not happened, the fixedness is destabilized. The settled past becomes a past that was wrong, and the wrongness is not comfortable. The figure who died twice is not aware of having done so. They were alive the whole time in the world that the records confirm. It is only in the specific version of the past that specific people's memories contain that the death happened. The memories carry the event. The world does not. And the gap between the memory's event and the world's absence of the event is the gap that the Mandela effect lives in, which is the gap between the past as it was and the past as it is carried. The grief was real. The loss was processed. The person is alive, and the memory holds a funeral for someone who was never there. Chapter 13. The book that read differently. There is a passage that you know. Not a passage you remember vaguely or approximately. Not a passage whose existence you recall without being able to reproduce it. A passage you know with the specific intimacy of repeated reading. A passage that entered memory through the particular route that meaningful text travels, through the combination of comprehension and emotional response that produces something more than a stored string of words. You can produce it, not necessarily word for word, but close enough that you would recognize a discrepancy if one were pointed out to you. The passage has a specific structure and a specific meaning and a specific place in the larger text that contains it. And all of these are part of what you know when you know the passage. And then you open the book and the passage is different. Not completely different, the context is the same. The characters or the argument or the imagery is recognizable. But a specific word is not the word you remember. A specific phrase has a slightly different arrangement. The sentence that you knew ends differently from how you remembered it ending, or contains a clause that you do not remember being there, or is missing a clause that you distinctly remember. The difference is not enormous. If someone asked you to describe the passage, your description would be close enough to be recognizable. But it is not what you remember, and the discrepancy is specific enough that you are certain the passage read differently before. The biblical text version of this is among the most emotionally significant in the Mandela Effect catalog, because the texts in question are ones that many people have not just read, but memorized, recited, heard in liturgical contexts where repetition was deliberate and frequent, carried through their lives as a kind of interior resource that is accessed at moments of significance. The King James Version of the Bible specifically is associated with a number of Mandela Effect memories. The passage in Isaiah that many people remember as, "The lion shall lie down with the lamb," appears in the actual text as, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb." The lion is not there. The wolf is. People who have known this passage for decades, who have heard it read aloud in religious services, who have quoted it and discussed it and found in it a specific image of peaceful coexistence, remember a lion and find a wolf. The emotional resonance of the lion imagery and the relative cultural prominence of the lion as a symbol of majesty and power that makes it a more striking partner for the vulnerable lamb than the wolf, creates conditions in which the schema for this passage is likely to contain the lion rather than the wolf. The lion lying down with the lamb is a more culturally salient image. The lion is the king of beasts. The image of such a powerful animal in peaceful coexistence with a small, vulnerable animal captures the essence of a transformed order in a more vivid way than the wolf, which is a predator but not a symbol of royal power. The schema that processes and stores this passage is likely to produce the version with the higher cultural salience, which is the version with the lion. The specific wording of the Lord's Prayer is another side of Mandela effect memories involving religious text. The version that many people know ends with the kingdom, the power, and the glory, rather than the version that ends differently or does not include the doxology at all in its original text. The history of different versions of the prayer, the fact that different Christian traditions use different forms, the fact that the version familiar to many people is a translation of a translation with its own history of modification, creates a complex source environment that is likely to produce exactly the kind of source confusion that produces Mandela effect memories. The version that is remembered may be accurate to a specific version that was encountered in a specific context, and that version may differ from the version in the book currently in hand. The passage from a novel that reads differently from how it is remembered is producing the same mechanism in a secular context. The reader who encountered the novel at a specific age, in a specific emotional state, in a specific set of circumstances that gave the passage its weight, encoded the passage in a form that was shaped by all of these factors. The form was not simply the words on the page, it was the words on the page as processed by that reader in those circumstances with those associations. The encoding captured the meaning as it was received, which is not necessarily identical to the meaning as it was written. When the passage is reconstructed in recall, the reconstruction draws on the encoded meaning rather than on the encoded words, and the words produced by the reconstruction are words that express the encoded meaning, which may differ from the words on the page. The specific case of a remembered passage differing from the actual text is interesting because it makes visible a feature of reading that is usually invisible. Reading is not a process of downloading the words into memory. It is a process of constructing meaning from the words, and the constructed meaning is what is stored. The stored meaning is stored in a form that is partly linguistic, and partly semantic, and partly emotional, and partly contextual. And when it is retrieved, the linguistic form that is produced may differ from the original, because the stored representation is not the original text. It is the reader's response to the original text, which is a related but different thing. Sacred texts have an additional layer of complexity because the words are themselves objects of reverence and not just vehicles for meaning. In traditions that treat the specific words as divinely given or as precisely crafted by human wisdom, the difference between remembering a word correctly and remembering the meaning correctly is not trivial. The person who remembers lion rather than wolf has remembered a meaning that is not wrong, exactly, because the image of a lion lying down with a lamb captures the same basic sense of transformed predatory relationships that the wolf version captures. But they have remembered a specific word that was not there, and in a context where the specific words matter. This is a significant error, even if the semantic content is approximately preserved. The text that reads differently today from how it read before is the text as it is in the book, against the text as it exists in the memory that encoded it. The book has not changed. The memory has stored something that differs from the book, in the way that all memories of texts differ from the texts themselves, which is by preserving the meaning at the expense of the exact wording. The difference usually goes unnoticed, because the wording is close enough that the occasional check against the text does not reveal a discrepancy. When the difference is large enough to be noticed, it has the specific character of the Mandela effect, a confident and vivid memory that conflicts with the current state of the record. The wolf lies down with the lamb. The lion lies down with it, in every memory, that found the lion more fitting for the thing the passage meant than the animal that was actually there. Chapter 14. The Logo and the Hyphen. There is a logo that you have seen thousands of times, not hundreds, thousands or perhaps tens of thousands, across years of grocery shopping and television commercials and the specific visual landscape of a culture that is saturated with brand imagery in ways that the culture before advertising existed could not have imagined. The logo entered visual memory through pure repetition, through the accumulated effect of brief glances across a lifetime of consumer exposure. You did not study it. You did not intend to memorize it. You memorized it the way the city memorizes the shape of a building you walk past every day, through the gradual accumulation of quick looks, none of which was careful, but which collectively produce something that feels like certain knowledge of what the thing looks like. And then someone asks you to draw it, or you try to describe it in detail, or you encounter a version of it that is claimed to be the correct one, and it doesn't look quite right. And the not quite rightness has a specific quality because you know what it looks like. You have seen it 10,000 times, and what you are looking at now is not what you have been seeing. Except it is. It is the correct one. It is what has always been there. And what you have been seeing for 10,000 glances was close to this, but not this, was a version constructed by visual memory from quick exposures that were never careful enough to capture every detail accurately. The hyphen is the specific case that belongs to the most famous brand logo Mandela effect. Kit Kat, the chocolate bar, is spelled Kit Kat. 2 words, no hyphen. Many people remember it as Kit Kat with a hyphen. The memory of the hyphen is specific and confident. People who grew up eating the product, who encountered the logo on every wrapper of every bar they consumed across years of childhood, remember the hyphen with the same specificity that they remember the red and white color scheme and the word chocolate and the arrangement of text on the packaging. The hyphen is in the memory as solidly as the other elements, and the hyphen was never there, not in the current product and not in any archival packaging that can be found, though the history of the product's presentation across different markets and different decades does include some variation in presentation. The Fruit Loops versus Fruit Loops case involves a different kind of error. The actual product name is Fruit Loops. Many people remember it as Fruit Loops, spelled with a genuine English word rather than the deliberate misspelling that is the actual branding. The actual name is a playful misspelling, and many people's memories corrected the misspelling and stored the name in its standard English spelling, which is not what appears on the box. The fast food chain is remembered by many people as Chick-fil-A or Chick-fil-A, with variations in the hyphenation and capitalization that differ from the actual branding, which uses a lowercase a after the hyphen. The specific details of capitalization and hyphenation in brand logos are exactly the kind of detail that quick glance processing does not reliably capture, because capitalization and hyphenation are syntactic and typographic features that require careful attention to register accurately, and the attention given to logos in passing is not of this quality. The psychology of logo memory has been studied directly, with results that are both unsurprising in their general direction and striking in their specific magnitude. A study conducted in 2020 by researchers at UCLA asked people to draw the Apple logo from memory. The Apple logo is among the most recognizable brand marks in the world, encountered by billions of people with extraordinary frequency in the decades since the company's rise. The participants were Apple users who saw the logo regularly. Less than half of them accurately drew the logo, meaning that more than half of people who see one of the most commonly seen logos in the world, multiple times daily, cannot accurately reproduce it from memory. The errors were not random, they were systematic, reflecting the way that quick glance processing captures approximate shape and general composition without capturing the specific details that distinguish the actual logo from the approximate one. The mechanism is the same mechanism that produces other Mandela effect memories, but the logo context makes it unusually vivid, because the conditions for accurate encoding are so clearly absent. The logo is seen frequently but briefly and without deliberate attention. Each exposure is a quick glance rather than a careful inspection. The cumulative effect of many quick glances is a visual representation that is accurate in its broad features and unreliable in its specific details. The broad features, the colors, the general composition, the overall visual character are encoded accurately because they are present and consistent across all the quick glances. The specific details, the exact shape of a letter form, the presence or absence of a hyphen, the capitalization pattern, the precise arrangement of elements, are not reliably captured by quick glances and are therefore unreliable in the stored representation. The destabilization that the discovery produces is specific to the logo context, because the logo is associated with a sense of familiarity that is among the most comfortable cognitive states. The familiar brand is a comfort, a known quantity, a point of stability in the visual environment. When the logo turns out to be slightly different from what was expected, the comfort is disrupted in a small but specific way. The thing that was known is revealed to not have been quite as known as it felt. The familiarity was real, but it was familiarity with something approximate, rather than with the thing itself. And the discovery of the approximation reveals that the certainty attached to the familiarity was not warranted by the quality of the knowledge that underlies it. The brand that embedded itself in memory through 10,000 quick glances is in the memory in the form that 10,000 quick glances can produce, which is a good approximation. The logo that is on the shelf and on the wrapper and in the advertisement is the logo. The logo that is in the memory is a reconstruction from quick glances, which is close to the logo, but is not the logo. The hyphen is what the memory added to make the reconstruction coherent. The fruit is what the memory corrected to make the name read like a word. The logo was always the same. The memory was always approximate, and the approximation was always confident, which is the part that makes the difference when the confidence and the logo finally meet. Chapter 15. The witness problem. There is a person standing in a courtroom. They have taken an oath. They are telling the truth or attempting to tell the truth in the fullest sense of the phrase, which means they are reporting what they believe they saw and heard and experienced. They are not guessing. They are not speculating. They are not constructing a story to fit a desired conclusion. They are accessing what they believe to be a genuine memory of a genuine event and reporting the contents of that memory as accurately as they can. Their confidence is real, and their intention is honest, and their memory is wrong. This is not an unusual situation. It is one of the most thoroughly documented problems in the entire literature of applied psychology. The eyewitness who is wrong is not the eyewitness who is lying. The eyewitness who is lying is a different problem with different solutions. The eyewitness who is wrong while being completely honest is the problem that the psychological research has been illuminating for the past 50 years, with results that have significant implications for how the legal system handles testimony and for how all of us should think about what memory does and does not reliably provide. Gary Wells, a psychologist at Iowa State University, who has spent his career studying eyewitness testimony, developed a distinction that has become foundational in the field. He separates system variables, which are features of the investigation process that can be controlled to improve accuracy, from estimator variables, which are features of the witness and the witnessing situation that cannot be controlled but can be estimated. The estimator variables are the features of the situation at the time of the crime. How long the witness had to observe the perpetrator, what the lighting conditions were, how stressed the witness was, whether the perpetrator was of the same race as the witness, whether a weapon was present, which tends to draw attention away from the perpetrator's face. The weapon focus effect is one of the more counterintuitive findings in the field. The presence of a weapon draws the witness's visual attention to the weapon and away from the perpetrator's face, producing a witness who has a good memory for the weapon and a poor memory for the face of the person holding it. This is the opposite of what naive intuition would predict. The presence of a weapon makes the event more threatening and more memorable, which might lead to the expectation that more of the event is accurately encoded. But attention is limited, and a threatening object captures visual attention in ways that reduce the attention available for other features of the scene. The memory of the weapon is vivid. The memory of the face is impaired. The stress effect is similarly counterintuitive in its implications. High stress improves some aspects of memory, specifically the memory of the central features of the stressful event, and impairs other aspects, specifically the memory of peripheral features. The witness to a violent crime may have a vivid memory of the violence itself and a poor memory of details that were present but not central. The confidence the witness feels in their memory of the central event may not extend appropriately to their memory of peripheral details, but the confidence itself is not well calibrated to this distinction. The witness may feel equally confident about details they encoded well and details they encoded poorly. The confidence-accuracy relationship is the finding that has had the most impact on legal practice, and it is among the most robust findings in the entire literature. Eyewitness confidence is a weak predictor of eyewitness accuracy. The witness who says, "I am absolutely certain," is not significantly more likely to be correct than the witness who says, "I think it was him, but I am not entirely sure." The certainty is a report about the subjective state of the memory, not about the quality of the original encoding. The certainty can be high when the encoding was poor, and it can be low when the encoding was actually adequate. Certainty tells you how the memory feels. It does not tell you how accurate it is. This finding has direct bearing on the Mandela effect. The Mandela effect memory is characterized precisely by high confidence. The person who remembers the E in Berenstain, the lion in Isaiah, the hyphen in Kit Kat, does not remember these things with the uncertainty that would be appropriate given the quality of the encoding. They remember them with certainty. The certainty does not reflect the quality of the encoding. It reflects the subjective state of the reconstruction, which feels like genuine memory, and which is accompanied by the confidence that genuine memory produces, regardless of whether the reconstruction is accurate. The post-event information effect, documented by Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues across decades of research, is one of the specific mechanisms that connects the eyewitness literature to the Mandela effect. Post-event information is information received after the original event that is later incorporated into the memory of the event. In the eyewitness context, this is information received between the crime and the trial, through conversations with other witnesses, through news coverage, through the suggestive questions of investigators. In the Mandela effect context, this is information received after the original exposure to the source material, through cultural transmission, through discussions with others, through subsequent encounters with related material. The post-event information does not enter memory with a label that marks it as having arrived after the event. It enters memory and is processed by the reconstruction system alongside the original encoding, and when the memory is subsequently reconstructed, the post-event information is available as a source alongside the original encoding. The reconstruction draws on whatever is available, and the post-event information may be more available, more recently encoded, more consistent with the schema than the original encoding. The reconstructed memory can therefore reflect the post-event information rather than the original event, without the person whose memory it is being able to detect this. The wrongful conviction literature makes the stakes of these findings concrete. The Innocence Project, which uses DNA evidence to exonerate people who were wrongfully convicted, has found that eyewitness misidentification is the most common cause of wrongful conviction in the cases they have reviewed. More than 2/3 of the wrongful convictions overturned by DNA evidence involved eyewitness testimony. The witnesses were not lying. They were reporting what they believed to be accurate memories. The memories were wrong. The legal system treated the confident testimony as reliable evidence. The people served prison sentences, sometimes long ones, for crimes they did not commit. The courtroom problem and the Mandela effect are different in almost every practical feature. The courtroom problem has enormous personal and social stakes. The Mandela effect is, in most cases, a benign puzzle. That they are the same phenomenon at the level of mechanism. Both involve confident memory that is wrong. Both involve the failure of the subjective certainty to track the accuracy of the reconstruction. Both demonstrate that the feeling of genuine memory is not a reliable indicator of genuine memory. The witness is certain. The certainty is real. The memory is not. And the certainty does not know that the memory is not, which is the problem that the certainty was always supposed to solve. Chapter 16. The Child Who Remembers Too Much. There is a child who is 2 years old and who is telling their parent about a life they lived before this one. Not in the way that children sometimes say imaginative things about being a different person. Not in the vague and shifting way that fantasy works in early childhood, where the details change and the story responds to the reactions of the audience. In a specific and consistent way. The child returns to the same details repeatedly. The same name, the same place, the same family members whose names the child produces without having encountered them, the same circumstances of a death that the child describes with a matter-of-factness that is unsettling not because it is dramatic, but because it is not, because it has the quality of someone reporting something they remember, rather than someone performing something they have been taught. The parent looks into what the child has said. The place is real, the family name is real, the circumstances of the death the child described correspond to a real death that occurred in the real place with the real family. The child has never been to the place. The family is unknown to the child's family. There is no evident pathway by which the information could have reached the child through ordinary means. This is the structure of the cases that the psychiatrist and researcher Ian Stevenson spent 40 years documenting at the University of Virginia. Stevenson was not a fringe figure. He was a mainstream academic who held an endowed chair at a major research university and who approached the phenomenon with the methodological care that his position required. He published in peer-reviewed journals. He traveled to the sites described by the children and investigated the verifiable claims. He distinguished between cases that could be explained by normal means and cases that resisted normal explanation. By the time he died in 2007, he had documented approximately 3,000 cases from dozens of countries, cases in which children produced specific, verifiable information about lives that had ended before the children were born. The cases are not uniformly convincing. The research has been criticized on methodological grounds, and the criticisms are substantive. The cases are retrospective in the sense that the verification occurs after the claims are made, rather than under controlled conditions, before the family has had opportunity to investigate. The families in countries where reincarnation is a cultural belief may be more likely to notice and report the relevant behaviors and statements than families in countries where it is not, introducing a sampling bias. The investigators who conducted the on-site investigations were often not blind to the claims being evaluated, creating the possibility of unconscious bias in how corroborating information was identified and weighted. These are real methodological problems, and they are not resolved by the volume of cases or by the sincerity of the investigator. The accumulation of cases that are individually imperfect does not produce certainty, and the sincerity of the researcher does not protect against the systematic biases that affect even careful observers. The cases are suggestive. They do not prove reincarnation. They do not prove any specific alternative explanation. They are cases that resist easy dismissal while not compelling any particular conclusion. What they do in the context of this series is represent the outer edge of the territory that this series has been exploring. The earlier chapters addressed cases where the false memory mechanism is clearly operative and the explanation in terms of reconstructive memory is adequate. The middle chapters addressed cases where the mechanism is less clear but still plausible. This chapter addresses cases that are at the boundary of what the false memory explanation can account for. The specific challenge is that the false memory explanation requires a source for the information that is misremembered. The Berenstain Bears case has an obvious source. The child saw the name many times and misremembered the spelling. The premature death cases have plausible sources in early reports, rumors, and source confusions. The past life cases in which the child produces verifiable information about a specific deceased person with no apparent pathway of prior exposure have no obvious source for the false memory. The false memory mechanism requires something to falsely remember. The mechanism does not generate information from nowhere. It distorts and reconstructs information that was received from somewhere. The cryptomnesia explanation attempts to provide the source. Cryptomnesia is the phenomenon of encountering information, forgetting the encounter, and later reproducing the information in a way that feels like original knowledge rather than like memory of the encounter. The child may have overheard a conversation, or seen a relevant document, or encountered the information through a channel that neither they nor the people around them can identify. The information entered memory, and the memory of its entry faded, while the information itself remained available. When the information is produced, it is produced as though it came from the child's own experience, rather than from the forgotten encounter. Cryptomnesia is a real phenomenon. It has been documented in cases of apparent plagiarism, where a writer reproduces material they encountered and forgot they encountered, genuinely believing they are producing original work. It has been documented in cases of apparent spontaneous composition, where a musician produces a melody that was encountered and forgotten. The phenomenon is real. The question is whether it can account for cases where the information is highly specific, personally relevant to a specific deceased individual, and produced by a child young enough that the opportunities for inadvertent exposure are significantly limited. The researchers who have followed Stevenson's work, including Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, have focused specifically on the cases that are most resistant to cryptomnesia and other normal explanations. They have documented cases in which the child produced the name and identifying information before any investigation occurred, in which the family was genuinely unknown to the child's family, and in which the corroboration was provided by people who had no contact with the child's family before the investigation. The subset of cases that survive these methodological filters is smaller than the full database, but it is not empty. What memory researchers make of this evidence is varied. Some dismiss it on methodological grounds that are legitimate, but do not fully account for the strongest cases. Some acknowledge the cases as genuinely puzzling without being able to fit them into any existing framework. Some argue that the cases represent evidence for a mechanism of information transfer that current neuroscience does not account for. None of these positions are scientifically settled. The child who remembers too much is a challenge to the account of memory as purely a function of individual experience. The account is adequate for almost everything that memory does. It is adequate for the Berenstain Bears and the Monopoly Man and the film quotes and the premature deaths. It may not be adequate for the child who names a person they never met in a place they never visited and describes a death that the records confirm. The 2-year-old tells the same story, again, to the parent who has started writing things down, because the details do not change, and the place is real, and the name is real, and there is no explanation. Chapter 17. The false memory that was planted. There is a memory that a person has of being lost in a shopping mall as a child. The memory is specific. They remember the fear, They remember the kind stranger who helped them. They remember being reunited with their family, the specific quality of the relief, the way the fear dissolved when the familiar faces appeared. The memory has the texture of a genuine childhood memory, the slightly blurred edges, and the emotional vividness that characterizes things recalled from early life. The person would describe this memory without hesitation if asked about difficult childhood experiences. They might have described it before, to friends or family, as part of the personal history they carry. The memory is entirely fabricated. The person was never lost in a shopping mall. The event did not happen. The memory was created by a researcher who suggested the event to the person through a specific protocol designed to induce the formation of a false memory, and the suggestion succeeded. The researcher then told the person the truth. The person did not always believe the researcher. This is the core finding of the Lost in the Mall study conducted by Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues in the early 1990s and published in 1995. The protocol involved asking participants to read 4 short narratives about childhood events that had allegedly been provided by a family member. 3 of the events had actually occurred, as confirmed by the family member who served as the source. The 4th event, the experience of being lost in a shopping mall, was entirely fabricated by the researchers. Participants were asked to remember as much as they could about each event. In follow-up interviews, approximately a quarter of participants produced memories of the fabricated mall event, elaborating on the suggestion with specific details that had not been provided, reporting the experience as though it were a genuine memory. The study has been replicated and extended in various forms. The specific percentage of participants who form false memories varies across studies and depends on the specific protocol, the specific false event, and the specific characteristics of the participant population. But the basic finding has proven robust. Suggestion, particularly suggestion that comes from a trusted source and that is embedded in genuine autobiographical material, can produce false memories in a significant proportion of people. The false memories are experienced as genuine by the people who have them. They are elaborated with details. They are defended when challenged. The researchers did not stop at the shopping mall. Subsequent studies implanted memories of increasingly improbable events and found that many remained implantable. Memories of witnessing demonic possession, memories of having fingers caught in a mousetrap, memories of having met Bugs Bunny at Disneyland, a character owned by Warner Brothers and therefore never actually present at a Disney theme park. The Bugs Bunny false memory study was designed specifically to test whether the impossibility of an event would prevent its implantation. It did not. Participants who had seen a fake advertisement suggesting they had met Bugs Bunny at Disneyland reported memories of the meeting, described shaking his hand, described the feel of his costume. The implanted memory was not obviously different to the person who had it from memories of events that actually occurred. The mechanism of memory implantation is continuous with the ordinary mechanism of memory reconstruction. The false memory is not a foreign object inserted into the memory system by an external force. It is a memory that the memory system created, using the same processes that it uses to create genuine memories, in response to the information provided by the suggestion. The suggestion provides the source material. The imagination supplies the details. The rehearsal, the repeated consideration of the suggested event, strengthens the memory trace. The emotional processing that may accompany the imaginative elaboration, the fear of being lost, the relief of reunion, deepens the encoding. The result is a memory that is indistinguishable from a genuine one because it was created by the same processes. Julia Shaw, a researcher who has specialized in criminal false memories, developed protocols for implanting memories not of childhood accidents, but of crimes. In studies published in 2015, she was able to induce a significant proportion of participants to believe they had committed a crime in their past, a crime that the researchers confirmed through family members had not occurred. The participants not only believed they had committed the crime, they provided elaborate accounts of it, described the emotions involved, named people who had been present. The false memory of having committed a crime was, to the person who held it, phenomenologically identical to a genuine memory. The implications for the Mandela effect are direct and important. If the false memory mechanism can produce detailed memories of events as significant as being lost, as emotionally charged as committing a crime, as specific as meeting a particular cartoon character in a particular location, then the mechanism is sufficient to produce the Mandela effect memories without requiring any additional explanation. The shared cultural suggestion, the ambient expectation that the Monopoly man wore a monocle or that the bears were the Berenstains, is a less targeted version of the suggestion that the researchers provided in their experiments. It is suggestion distributed through culture rather than delivered directly by a trusted source, and it reaches people in different forms and with different intensities. But it is suggestion, and the research shows that suggestion is sufficient to produce false memories. The additional finding that is relevant to the Mandela effect is the persistence of false memories even after correction. In many of the implanted memory studies, participants who were told that one of their reported memories was fabricated did not simply accept the correction and update their belief. Some of them defended the memory against the correction, insisting that the event had occurred. Some of them showed a temporary reduction in confidence that subsequently returned. The false memory, once formed, was not easily dislodged by being told it was false, which is exactly what the Mandela effect experience feels like from the inside. The records say the Berenstain Bears were always spelled with an A. The memory says there was an E. The records are credible. The memory is also credible. The person who has the memory is not easily moved by being told the memory is wrong, because the memory does not feel wrong. What the false memory research establishes is that the memory system is creative in a way that is not immediately apparent from the inside. The memory system creates memories as well as storing them. The creation is automatic and is not experienced as creation. The created memory is experienced as retrieved. The experience of retrieval does not distinguish between genuine retrieval and creative reconstruction, because both feel like the same thing, which is the experience of a past event made present by the act of remembering. The memory was planted. It grew into what memories grow into, which is certainty that the planted thing was always there. Chapter 18. The emotion that seals the memory wrong. There is a belief about memory that most people hold without having explicitly formed it. A belief that operates as a background assumption about how the relationship between emotion and memory works. The belief is that strong emotion preserves memory, that the moments of greatest feeling, the moments when the world seems most vivid and most present and most consequential, are the moments that are stored most accurately. That the intensity of the experience at the time of encoding translates into the fidelity of the record. That if you want to know whether a memory is reliable, you can consult the emotional weight it carries, and the heavier the weight, the more reliable the memory. This belief is not entirely wrong. Strong emotion does enhance certain aspects of memory encoding. The central features of an emotionally significant event, the core of what happened, the thing that made the event significant, tend to be stored more robustly than the central features of a neutral event. The emotional response directs attention to the most salient features, and the directed attention produces stronger encoding of those features. If you want to remember whether something happened at all, emotion helps. If you want to remember the gist of what happened, emotion helps. The belief that emotion preserves memory captures something real. What the belief misses, and what the research has been establishing for several decades, is that the same emotional response that enhances the encoding of the central features of an event impairs the encoding of the peripheral features, and more importantly, produces a specific set of distortions in the memory of the central features themselves that are not prevented, and in some cases are amplified by the emotional intensity. The strong emotion that makes the event feel unforgettable is also the condition in which the memory of the event is most vulnerable to specific kinds of error. The emotional seal on the memory is real. The memory it seals is not necessarily accurate. The flashbulb memory is the term for the kind of memory that results from highly emotional, surprising, and consequential events, named for the sudden, illuminating intensity of the experience that seems to fix the scene in memory the way a camera flash fixes an image in a photograph. The term was coined by the psychologists Roger Brown and James Kulik in 1977, who proposed that there was a special memory mechanism specifically evolved to preserve such moments. They studied memories of the assassination of John F. Kennedy and found that people reported highly detailed and confident memories of where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. Memories that had the quality of photographs of the moment rather than the blurred reconstruction of ordinary recollection. The flashbulb memory hypothesis predicted that these memories would be unusually accurate, preserved by the special mechanism with a fidelity that ordinary memories could not achieve. The subsequent research did not support the prediction. When flashbulb memories were tested against objective records, they showed error rates comparable to ordinary memories. They were wrong about specific details at similar frequencies. The confidence that accompanied them was high, higher than the confidence associated with ordinary memories, but the higher confidence was not matched by higher accuracy. The feeling of having a photograph was real. The photograph was not there. Ulrich Neisser's study of the Challenger memories, which was discussed earlier in this series, is the most cited example of flashbulb memory failure. The Challenger disaster was exactly the kind of event that the flashbulb mechanism was supposed to preserve. It was sudden, unexpected, consequential, and emotionally significant. The memories that participants reported were confident and detailed, and they were wrong at high rates when checked against the accounts produced on the day after the event. The specific distortions that emotional events introduce into memory are not random. They follow patterns that reflect the specific ways that emotion affects the cognitive processes involved in encoding and reconstruction. One pattern is the already mentioned weapon focus, where attention is drawn to the emotionally salient element of the scene at the expense of peripheral elements. Another pattern is the consistency bias, the tendency for memories to be reconstructed in ways that are consistent with the person's current beliefs and feelings about the event and the people involved in it. The memory is reconstructed to tell a coherent story that fits the person's current understanding, and the current understanding is shaped by all the emotional processing that has occurred since the original event. The consistency bias is particularly relevant to the Mandela effect cases that involve emotionally significant figures. The memories of Mandela's prison death are not being held by people who are indifferent to Mandela. They are being held by people for whom Mandela was a symbol of something important, people who engaged emotionally with his imprisonment and with the anti-apartheid struggle. The emotional engagement provided the conditions for the false memory to form, and it also provides the conditions for the false memory to be defended against correction. The memory is consistent with the emotional understanding of the figure and the period. The correction is inconsistent with the emotional understanding. The emotional encoding that produced the false memory also protects it from revision. The memory of the traumatic event, the violent crime witnessed, the accident experienced, the loss sustained, carries with it a certainty that is among the most difficult to revise through the provision of contradictory evidence. The person who says, "I know what I saw," has an experiential basis for the claim that is not accessible to the person presenting the contradictory evidence. The experiential basis is the felt intensity of the experience, the vividness of the memory, the certainty that accompanies it. What the research has established is that the felt intensity, the vividness, and the certainty are poor predictors of accuracy. The emotion that seems to guarantee the memory is the same emotion that distorts it. The feeling that something is important enough to remember accurately is not the same as something being remembered accurately. The importance increases the salience. The salience increases the encoding strength of the central features. The increased encoding strength produces a confident memory. The confident memory is not, for the reasons the research has established, a reliable memory. The confidence and the reliability are both real properties of the memory, but they are independent of each other in ways that the folk theory of flashbulb memory does not acknowledge. The Mandela effect memories that are most firmly held, the ones that survive the most confident reporting and the most resistant defense against correction, are precisely the ones that were most emotionally processed. The death of a figure who mattered, the product of childhood that was tied to a period of life that is now lost, the line from a film that was first seen at an age of intense emotional engagement with the world. The emotion sealed the memory. The seal is tight. The memory inside the seal is wrong. The feeling of importance does not guarantee accuracy. It guarantees certainty, which is a different thing. Chapter 19. The Internet that should have settled this. There is a reasonable expectation that the Internet should have made the Mandela effect impossible. The argument is simple and initially compelling. The Mandela effect depends on the absence of easily accessible verification. People misremember the Berenstain Bears because they are working from memories formed in childhood and have not recently held the actual books in their hands and looked at the actual name. People misremember film quotes because they are working from memories formed in theaters or living rooms decades ago and are not currently watching the film. The internet provides immediate access to the verification. The name can be checked in seconds. The film can be verified without leaving the chair. The archive is accessible. The resolution should be trivial. The internet has not resolved the Mandela effect. It has intensified it, formalized it, given it a name, and provided the infrastructure for communities of shared false certainty that would not have been possible before it existed. The expected verification has not occurred at scale. Instead, the internet has demonstrated something unexpected about the relationship between accessible information and belief revision, which is that accessible information does not automatically produce belief revision, that the presence of the correct answer does not guarantee that the correct answer is received and accepted, and that communities organized around shared false memories are capable of developing internal explanatory systems that insulate the shared memory against the easily accessible verification. The Mandela effect as a named phenomenon exists because of the internet. Before the internet, people had individual false memories and occasionally discovered that others shared them through personal conversation. The discovery was local and intermittent and did not scale. With the internet, the person who remembered Mandela's prison death could find, within minutes of beginning a search, thousands of other people who shared the same memory. The community of shared rememberers could form across geographic and demographic boundaries that would have prevented it from forming through personal connection. The internet aggregated the individual false memories into a visible collective phenomenon and gave the collective phenomenon a name and a community of practice. The community of practice developed norms and explanatory frameworks. The shared memory was treated as evidence rather than as error. The accessibility of the verification was acknowledged but reinterpreted. When the community member searches for the Berenstain Bears and finds the finding does not resolve the question. It is incorporated into the explanatory framework as further evidence that the timeline shifted, that the records in the current timeline reflect the current reality rather than the previous reality in which the existed. The accessible verification becomes evidence for the theory rather than evidence against the memory, because the theory explicitly predicts that the verifiable record will show the current reality rather than the previous one. This is a specific and interesting failure mode of the expectation that accessible information will produce belief revision. The failure mode requires two things. First, the community must develop an explanatory framework that makes the verification consistent with the shared belief, rather than contradictory to it. Second, the community must be able to maintain and reinforce the framework through the kinds of interactions that social communities enable. The internet provides the infrastructure for both. The explanatory frameworks of the Mandela effect, the timeline shift theory and its variants, were developed through community discussion and are available to new community members who discover the phenomenon and seek to understand it. The social reinforcement of the framework occurs continuously through the community's ongoing activity. The internet also functions as an amplifier of the social transmission of the misremembering itself. The Berenstain Bears spelling was misremembered by individuals before the internet existed. With the internet, the misremembering could be transmitted to new people through content about the Mandela effect that mentioned the name in its misremembered form, through social media posts, through comment sections, through the enormous volume of text that discusses the phenomenon and that mentions the names and details as people misremember them. The person who encounters the Mandela effect through internet content, who reads that many people remember the Berenstain Bears as the Berenstein Bears, is being exposed to the through the content itself. If they subsequently try to remember the name, the that was in the content is available as a source alongside their original encoding, and the subsequent memory may reflect the content rather than the original source. The recommendation algorithms that shape what people encounter online have a specific effect on Mandela effect communities. The person who shows interest in Mandela effect content is shown more Mandela effect content. The more Mandela effect content they consume, the more the shared misrememberings are reinforced in their memory. The reinforcement occurs through the ordinary mechanism of repetition, which strengthens memory traces, regardless of the accuracy of the content being repeated. The algorithm optimizes for engagement rather than for accuracy, and content that produces the emotional response of recognition. The specific feeling of having your private misremembering validated by a community of thousands is highly engaging. The recommendation system drives people toward the community, and the community reinforces the misremembering. The confirmation bias effect is amplified by the architecture of online search. The person who searches for Mandela effect evidence and finds the Berenstain Bears result showing the A may interpret the result as a single data point in a contested question rather than as a settled fact, because the community discourse has taught them to treat the verifiable record as potentially unreliable. They may then search specifically for Mandela effect evidence and find the community content that validates the E. The sequence of searches, driven by the community-supplied interpretive framework, produces a search behavior that reinforces the false memory rather than correcting it. The specific expectation that the internet would resolve collective misremembering rested on a model of information access that treats the provision of accurate information as sufficient for belief revision. As psychological research on belief revision has consistently found that this model is inadequate. Belief revision requires more than access to accurate information. It requires that the accurate information be received from a credible source, that the receiver be in a state of openness to revision, that the accurate information be processed against a background schema that can accommodate it, and that the social environment of the receiver support the revision rather than reinforcing the original belief. The internet has changed the availability of information without changing the psychological conditions under which information produces belief revision. The internet has made more information available to more people more quickly than at any previous point in history. It has also made more misinformation available to more people more quickly than at any previous point in history. The same infrastructure that makes verification accessible makes the community of false certainty accessible. The same recommendation system that could direct people to accurate information directs them to whatever produces the engagement response, which is often the content that validates what they already believe. The information was available. It was not received. The verification was a click away. Chapter 20. The self that needs the story to be true. There is a memory that is not just a memory. It is a piece of something larger, something that the person who holds it would not easily name, but that is present in the holding, in the specific quality of the resistance when someone suggests the memory might be wrong. The resistance is not purely epistemic, not purely a matter of believing that the evidence supports the memory against the challenger's evidence. It has a different texture than that. It feels more like the resistance to having something taken away than the resistance to being told a fact is wrong. What is at stake in the challenge is not just the accuracy of a specific recollection. What is at stake is something the memory is doing that accurate memories and inaccurate memories do equally well, because what the memory is doing is not about accuracy. Memory does not only store the past, it constitutes the self. The person you understand yourself to be is built from the memories you carry, from the narrative that connects the present you to all the previous versions of you, from the meaning that the past events in the memory are understood to have. When a memory is challenged and revised, it is not just a file that is being updated. It is an element of the self-narrative that is being changed. And the self-narrative, even in small details, is not changed without some resistance from the self that has been organized around it. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur's concept of narrative identity, which appeared briefly in the Existential Dread series, is directly relevant here. Ricoeur argued that the self is not a fixed entity that exists prior to and independently of the narrative it tells about itself. The self is the narrative. The continuity of identity across time is constituted by the coherence of the story that connects the past self to the present self. When elements of that story are challenged, the challenge is to the coherence of the self. The resistance to the challenge is the self protecting its own coherence, which is not a trivial or irrational response. Coherence is not a luxury. It is what makes the self a self, rather than a collection of disconnected moments. The specific memories that are held most fiercely, that generate the most resistance when challenged, are the memories that are doing the most work in the narrative. The memory that is a minor detail of an unremarkable afternoon is easily revised without significant resistance. The memory that is connected to a sense of who you are, to a period of life that was formative, to a figure who was significant, to a community whose shared past you participate in, resists revision in proportion to the work it is doing. The Berenstain Bears memory is not just a memory about the spelling of a name. It is a memory embedded in the texture of a childhood that they carry, and that is part of who they understand themselves to be. Revising the spelling revises, in a small but real way, the childhood that the spelling is part of. The community dimension of this adds another layer. The person who participates in a Mandela effect community is not just holding a private false memory. They are participating in a shared narrative that the community has built around the shared memories. The shared narrative is social. It connects the person to others who share the memory. It provides a framework of meaning. The timeline shift theory or the simulation theory or whatever explanatory account the community has developed that makes the shared false memory significant rather than merely mistaken. Revising the memory means not just updating a personal narrative, but departing from a social one. The departure has social costs. The community of shared false certainty is a community. Revising the shared certainty means leaving the community. The identity function of memory is not specific to the Mandela effect. It is a general feature of how memory works in the context of self-construction. But the Mandela effect cases make it unusually visible because the conflict between the memory and the verifiable record is so clear. In most cases where memory does identity work, the conflict between the memory and the external record is not so visible, and the identity function operates below the surface of what appears to be a straightforward factual belief. The Mandela effect cases are cases where the identity function has been exposed by the visibility of the conflict, where the gap between the memory and the record makes the resistance to revision striking rather than invisible. The therapeutic literature on memory provides a different window into this dynamic. The memories that are most difficult to revise in therapeutic contexts are the memories that are most central to the person's understanding of their own history and identity. The belief that a childhood was a certain way, that a relationship was a certain kind, that a formative event had a certain meaning, resists revision, not because the evidence for the belief is strong, but because the self that has been constructed around the belief would need to be reconstructed around the revised version. The reconstruction is costly. It requires revisiting not just the specific memory, but all the other memories and meanings that were organized around it. This is not an argument that memories should not be revised when they are wrong. It is an argument for understanding the resistance to revision as something other than simple stubbornness or irrationality. The person who holds the Mandela effect memory and resists the correction is not simply refusing to look at the evidence. They are, partly and not always consciously, protecting something that the evidence cannot address. The evidence shows that the record says the A was always there. The evidence does not address what the E means to the person who remembers it. The E is part of a childhood. The correction revises the childhood. The self that holds the childhood resists the revision. There is a specific version of this that appears in the more elaborate Mandela effect theories, where the false memory has been reframed not as an error, but as a distinction. The person who remembers the E in Berenstain is not someone who made a memory error. They are someone who remembers the previous timeline, someone who came from a different version of the world, someone whose memory is evidence of a capacity to retain information across timeline shifts. This framing transforms the false memory from a liability, a piece of evidence of fallible cognition, into an asset, a piece of evidence of a special relationship to the structure of reality. The self that needs the story to be true has found a story in which the false memory is not a failure but a gift. The gift is not real, the need for it is, and the need is not stupid. It is the self, looking for a way to stay coherent, in a world that keeps showing it, that some of what it thought it remembered was never there. Chapter 21. The alternate you who remembers correctly. There is a thought that sits at the intersection of the many worlds interpretation, the Mandela effect, and the ordinary human experience of wishing things had been otherwise. The thought is this: if the timeline shift theory is correct, if the memories that conflict with the current record are genuine memories of a reality that once existed and no longer does, then somewhere in the branching structure of possible worlds, there is a version of you for whom no revision was necessary. A version who remembers the Berenstain Bears as the Berenstain Bears, because in that version, the Berenstain Bears is what they are. A version who watched the Mandela funeral coverage in the 1980s, because in that version, the funeral happened. A version for whom the memory and the record are in perfect agreement, for whom the certainty is not just felt but warranted, for whom the specific disorientation of discovering that what you remember does not match what exists has never occurred. This alternate you lives in the timeline you came from, according to the theory. They did not slip. The slip was yours. You carried the memory across the boundary that they remained on the correct side of. They look at the Berenstain Bears books and see the name they remember. They watch the archived footage of the Mandela coverage and find what they expect to find. They have never had the experience of being told by the record that what their memory insists is true is not. Their certainty and their reality are aligned in the way that most people assume all certainties and realities are aligned, before the Mandela effect teaches them otherwise. The appeal of this thought is not difficult to understand, and the appeal does not require believing the theory to be literally true. The thought is appealing because it does something that the psychological explanation of the Mandela effect does not do, which is to fully validate the experience of the person who holds the false memory. The psychological explanation says the memory feels real, but is wrong. The timeline theory says the memory is real and the world changed around it. The alternate you who remembers correctly is the version of the theory that makes the memory not just understandable, but accurate, that places the error in the world rather than in the mind. The many worlds interpretation, which provides the physical vocabulary for this thought, does posit the existence of an enormous number of branches in which the outcomes of quantum events differ from their outcomes in this branch. The question of whether any of these branches correspond to worlds where the Berenstain Bears were spelled with an E is a question about the relationship between quantum branching and macroscopic cultural phenomena, and it is a relationship that the interpretation does not specify in a way that would answer the question. Quantum branching occurs at the scale of individual quantum events, the decay of a radioactive nucleus, the absorption of a photon, and the branches diverge at that scale before decoherence propagates the divergence to the macroscopic scale. Whether the propagation of quantum divergence to the macroscopic scale ever produces the specific kind of difference that the Mandela effect requires is not something the interpretation predicts. But setting aside the physical question and dwelling in the thought for its own sake reveals something interesting about the human relationship to the idea of alternate selves. The alternate you who remembers correctly is not just a version who has the accurate memory. They are a version who never experienced the specific disorientation of the Mandela effect, which is the disorientation of certainty failing. Their confidence and their reality match. Ours sometimes do not. The alternate you is living in the world where the certainties work, where what feels true is true, where the self and the record are in agreement. There is a specific form of peace in the image of that version, a peace that the Mandela effect experience, by demonstrating that certainty is fallible, has taken away. The parallel to other experiences of the alternate self is worth noting. The alternate you who took the different fork, who stayed instead of leaving or left instead of staying, who made the choice that the actual you did not make, is a figure that human beings find both compelling and melancholy. Compelling because the alternate self is a complete life, a fully realized version that runs alongside the actual one, and that might have been just as real. Melancholy because the alternate self is inaccessible, because the fork was taken and cannot be retaken, because the alternate timeline, in whatever sense it exists without you. The alternate you who remembers correctly belongs to this family of alternate selves. They are the version who did not slip, who did not carry the wrong memory across the timeline boundary. They are complete and real and inaccessible. The psychological function of the alternate self is something that therapists and philosophers have both noticed. The thought of the alternate self who made the other choice, who lives the other life, who remembers correctly, provides a kind of external validation for experiences that feel real, but that the current world does not confirm. The alternate self says, "You were not wrong, the world changed. Your memory was right about the world you were in," and the alternate you who stayed in that world still has the memory that matches the record. What happened to you is not that you misremembered. This validation is not available from the psychological explanation, which says the memory is wrong and the mind is fallible. The psychological explanation does not provide a version of the story in which the experience of certainty was warranted. The timeline shift theory does. The alternate you who remembers correctly is the figure who makes the certainty warranted in the counterfactual. If you had stayed in the previous timeline, your certainty would match your world. The mismatch is the consequence of the slip, not of the fallibility of your mind. The comfort of this is real even when the theory is held lightly, even when the person who entertains it does not fully believe it. The thought experiment of the alternate you who remembers correctly is a way of honoring the experience of the false memory, of taking seriously the felt reality of the certainty, of not dismissing what the experience was like in favor of what the explanation says it was. The experience was of genuine certainty. The alternate you lives in a world where that certainty was justified. The thought of that version does not change what the current world contains, but it changes how the experience of the current world feels, because it provides an account in which the experience was accurate, even if the memory was not. The alternate you is not there. The branch that would contain them is not accessible. But the thought of them is available, and the thought does what the thought is needed to do, which is to say, you were not entirely wrong. You were in a place where your certainty was right, and then you were here. Chapter 22, The Historian's Nightmare. There is a document in an archive. It was produced at the time of the events it describes, or close enough to that time that the question of how accurately it reflects what occurred is the question of how accurately the person who produced it observed and recorded, rather than how accurately they remembered and reconstructed. The document is primary source material. The historian's hierarchy of evidence places it near the top. The closer to the event and the less filtered through subsequent reconstruction, the more reliable the source. The document at the time of the event is the gold standard. The memoir written 40 years later is considerably less reliable. The secondary account based on secondary accounts is less reliable still. The hierarchy is sensible, and it has served historical inquiry well. The Mandela effect suggests that the hierarchy has an assumption embedded in it that deserves examination. The assumption is that the people who produce primary sources observe and record accurately, that the document at the time of the event captures what was there because it was produced by witnesses who were present. What the research on memory and perception has established is that observation itself is a reconstructive process, that the event is not simply received by the observer and then transmitted to the document. It is processed, interpreted, filtered through schemas and prior knowledge and emotional states and the specific conditions of the observation, and then recorded. The record is not the event. It is the observer's reconstruction of the event, subject to the same distortions that affect any reconstruction, recorded in a durable form before the reconstruction has had time to drift further. The implications are not that historical records are unreliable in ways that prevent the recovery of the past. The implications are more specific and more interesting than that. Historical records are reliable in the way that all reconstructive processes are reliable, which is to say, they capture the general shape of what happened, with reasonable accuracy and with specific distortions that follow patterns that can be identified and partially compensated for. The historian who understands the distortion patterns is better positioned to read the sources than the historian who does not. The Mandela effect research illuminates the distortion patterns in a context that makes them unusually visible, because the specific memories being studied are ones where the archive is intact, and the discrepancy between memory and record can be verified. The collective false memory is a particularly significant challenge for historical understanding, because history depends on collective memory in ways that individual memory depends on individual memory. The historical record is not only the documents. It is the tradition of interpreting the documents, the consensus about what they mean, the shared understanding of what the past contained and what it means for the present. This collective interpretive tradition is vulnerable to the same mechanisms that produce Mandela effect memories in individuals. Shared schemas produce shared interpretations. Cultural transmission of historical understanding reinforces specific readings. The emotional significance of certain historical events and figures produces the same kind of biased encoding at the collective level that emotion produces at the individual level. The history of history includes a long record of collective misremembering that was eventually corrected by the recovery of better evidence. The medievalist historian Norman Cantor documented the ways in which Victorian scholars' reading of the Middle Ages was shaped by their own cultural moment, and produced a picture of the medieval world that was more a projection of Victorian values and concerns than an accurate representation of the medieval period. The Whig interpretation of history, which read the development of British parliamentary democracy as a narrative of inevitable progress toward the present, was identified by Herbert Butterfield in 1931 as a systematic distortion produced by reading the past through the lens of the present. The revisionist movement in various historical fields, from the history of science to the history of race to the history of gender and sexuality, has consisted largely of the identification and correction of distortions introduced by the schemas and emotional investments of previous historians. These corrections are not instances of one faction replacing another's bias with its own. At their best, they are instances of the historical discipline doing what it is supposed to do, which is to check the collective memory against the available evidence and revise the memory when the evidence and the memory conflict. The discipline has the mechanisms for this. The peer review of historical scholarship, the archival research that produces new primary sources, the methodological discussions that make explicit the interpretive frameworks being applied. These are the tools by which collective historical misremembering is identified and partially corrected. What the Mandela effect reveals is the scale and specificity of the distortions that collective memory can introduce, even in the presence of a stable and accessible record. The Berenstain Bears books exist in libraries and in people's homes and in digital archives and in every format in which children's books are preserved. The name on the spine is available to be checked. And yet, the collective misremembering of the name persists and has persisted across decades without the accessibility of the correction, producing the correction in the collective memory. The record was always there. The collective memory was not looking at it carefully. If the collective memory can misremember the spelling of a name on a book that is sitting on the shelf, what does this imply about the collective memory of events that are not on the shelf, that exist only in documents produced by observers whose own reconstructive processes introduce their own distortions, that have been transmitted through chains of interpretation, each of which added its own layer? The implication is not that we cannot know anything about the past. It is that what we know is always a reconstruction, always shaped by the schemas and emotional investments of the people who produced and transmitted the knowledge, and always in need of the checking against the evidence that the historical discipline exists to provide. The historian's nightmare is the realization that the tools for checking collective memory against the evidence are the same tools that were used to produce the collective memory that needs checking. The historians who identify the distortions in previous historiography are themselves historians whose work will be checked by subsequent historians who will find distortions in their own accounts. The process does not converge on a perfect account. It converges, slowly and imperfectly, on accounts that are less distorted than the ones they replaced. The Berenstain Bears are in the archive. The name is there. History is also in the archive. But history is larger than the archive, and the part that is larger is collective memory, which is reconstructive all the way down. Chapter 23. The memory you are making right now. There is something happening to this moment as you are in it. Not after it ends, not in the hours or days that follow when the memory is consolidated and the forgetting begins and the reconstruction is made available for retrieval. Right now. The moment is being processed as it occurs, and the processing is not neutral. The attention that is directed towards certain features of the experience and away from others is already determining which features will be available for encoding and which will not. The emotional response that accompanies the experience is already shaping which features will be encoded with what strength. The schemas that are active as you encounter the experience are already influencing how the features that are attended to are interpreted, and the interpretation is what gets encoded rather than the raw sensory data. The moment as you experience it is not the moment as it will be remembered. The moment as you experience it is itself already a construction, as was discussed in the context of perception and the blind spot. The moment as it will be remembered is a further construction, built from the traces of the first construction. The moment as it is eventually retrieved is a third construction, built from the traces of the second. Each construction is a reasonable approximation of the preceding one, reasonable enough to serve the practical functions that memory serves. None of them is the moment itself, which is not stored anywhere and is not accessible to any of the constructions. The attention selectivity is the first editing. Attention is a limited resource, and the moment presents more features than attention can simultaneously process. The features that receive attention are the ones that are consistent with the current goals and schemas and emotional responses. The features that do not receive attention are not encoded and will not be available for retrieval. You are in a room, and the room has a temperature and a smell and a specific quality of light and specific sounds and specific visual details that your peripheral vision is receiving without your focused attention registering them. Most of these will not be in the memory of this moment because they were not attended to. The memory will contain the features that were in the focus of attention, which were the features that seemed relevant or interesting or emotionally significant. The emotional response is the second editing. The features of the moment that are attended to are encoded with a strength that reflects their emotional significance. Features that produce a strong emotional response are encoded more strongly than features that do not. The strong encoding does not guarantee accuracy, as the previous chapter established. The emotionally significant feature will be available for retrieval when the memory is reconstructed, in a way that less significant features may not be. The editing is toward the emotionally significant. The mundane is compressed or lost. The schema imposition is the third editing. The features that are attended to and emotionally responded to are interpreted through the active schemas. The interpretation is what is encoded, rather than the raw feature. If the schema expects a friendly interaction, the ambiguous gesture is interpreted as friendly and encoded as such. If the schema expects a threatening interaction, the same gesture is interpreted as threatening and encoded as such. The encoding does not contain the ambiguity that the feature itself contained. It contains the interpretation that the schema imposed on the ambiguity. When the memory is later retrieved, the retrieved interpretation will feel like a retrieved observation, because the encoding did not mark it as an interpretation rather than an observation. The immediate post-experience period is when the consolidation occurs, the process by which the traces of the experience are converted into the more durable form that will be available for long-term retrieval. Consolidation takes time, which is why the disruption of the immediate post-experience period, through sleep deprivation or stress or the introduction of interfering information, can affect what is ultimately stored. The immediate post-experience period is also the period when the first reconstruction occurs, when the person reviews what just happened, tells someone about it, or simply reflects on it. This first reconstruction is the foundation for all subsequent retrievals. If the first reconstruction contains an error, the error is in the trace that subsequent retrievals will draw on. The telling is a specific and powerful form of editing. When you tell someone about what just happened, you select from the available traces the features that are most relevant to the telling, organize them into a narrative that has the structure of a story, and produce a verbal account that shapes the subsequent memory. The features that were included in the telling are reinforced. The features that were omitted are more likely to fade. The narrative structure imposed by the telling is incorporated into the memory trace and will shape subsequent retrievals, which will have the structure of the told story rather than the structure of the raw experience. The act of telling makes the story more available than the experience. There is a specific implication of all this for the Mandela effect. The memories that produce Mandela effects are memories that were subject to these editing processes at the time they were formed, and that have been subject to subsequent reconstruction processes every time they were retrieved, or discussed, or thought about in the intervening years. Each retrieval is an opportunity for additional editing, for the introduction of post-event information, for the reinforcement of the version that was told rather than the version that was experienced. The Mandela effect memory is the product of many successive editing rounds, each of which was invisible to the person doing the editing, each of which felt like accurate retrieval rather than additional construction. The moment you are making right now will be available to you in a form that is already quite different from the moment itself by the time you first retrieve it tomorrow. It will be more different still by the time you retrieve it a year from now. The direction of the difference is not random. It will be more consistent with your schemas, more emotionally simplified, more narratively coherent, more like what you expect this kind of moment to be than like what this specific moment was. The editing is toward the expected. The expected is what the schemas predict. The schemas were built from all the previous moments and all the previous memories of moments, which were themselves edited in the same direction. The memory of this moment is being made right now, from less than you think, and will be available later as more than was there, which is not a failure. It is how memory works, which is the thing this entire series has been trying to show you. Chapter 24. The truth that nobody owns. There is a question underneath the Mandela effect that is larger than any of the specific cases. Larger than the Berenstain Bears and the Monopoly Man and the film quotes and the premature deaths. The question that all of the specific cases are pointing toward, without any of them being sufficient to answer it, is the question of what reality is and who gets to say, not in the political or rhetorical sense of who has the power to define the narrative, though that is a real and important question. In the philosophical sense of what is actually true about the nature of the relationship between the world and the minds that inhabit it. Whether reality is something that exists prior to and independently of any mind that encounters it, fixed and singular and available to be correctly or incorrectly perceived. Or whether reality is something more entangled with the minds that observe it, something that is shaped in specific and consequential ways by the act of observation, something that is not fully specifiable independently of the observers who encounter it. This question has been at the heart of philosophy since before philosophy had a name, and it has not been answered to anyone's complete satisfaction, which is evidence not of philosophical failure, but of the difficulty of the question. The question is genuinely hard. The difficulty is not a puzzle waiting for a clever solution. It is the mark of a question whose answer requires a kind of thinking that has not yet been developed, or that requires engaging with features of the situation that resist the kind of analysis that has been applied to it. The materialist or realist position holds that reality is what it is independently of any mind that perceives it. The Berenstain Bears books have always had an A and not an E. The film has always contained the line it contains and not the line that people remember. Nelson Mandela was alive until 2013, and the world was as the records show it to have been throughout that period. The minds that misremember these things are not encountering a different reality. They are encountering the same reality and processing it incorrectly. Reality is fixed. The minds that report on reality vary in their accuracy. The variation is in the minds, not in the reality. This position is not obviously wrong. In fact, it is very probably correct as a description of the specific Mandela effect cases. The Berenstain Bears books have an A. The records are accurate. The misremembering minds are the source of the discrepancy. The position handles the specific cases well and provides a coherent framework for understanding the phenomenon. The idealist or constructivist position holds that reality is not fully independent of the minds that perceive it. This position holds that the world as we encounter it is always the world as constituted by experience and cognition, that the idea of a reality entirely prior to and independent of any mind is incoherent, that the raw material of experience is shaped by the categories and structures that the mind brings to it in ways that cannot be separated out to recover the unmediated real. The quantum mechanical observation that measurement participates in determining the state of a quantum system, rather than simply revealing a pre-existing state, provides a contemporary scientific context for this ancient philosophical position, though the relationship between the quantum result and the philosophical claim is more complex than straightforward endorsement. In its weaker forms, the constructivist position holds not that reality is created by minds, but that what is accessible to us is always the intersection of the world and the cognitive structures we bring to it, and that this intersection is what we mean by reality in practice. The practical reality, the reality we navigate and remember and discuss, is always partly constituted by the minds encountering it. The Berenstain Bears books have an A, but the Berenstain Bears books as they exist in the cultural reality of a community, as they exist in the shared memory and shared discussion of a generation that grew up with them, exist partly in the form that the shared memory has given them. The cultural object and the physical object are not identical. Neither of these positions fully dissolves into the other, and neither should. The tension between them is productive rather than a problem to be resolved. The realist position captures the fact that there is a world that is what it is, regardless of what anyone thinks about it. A world that the scientific enterprise has been successfully investigating for centuries and that pushes back against incorrect descriptions of it. The constructivist position captures the fact that the world we encounter is always the world as processed by minds that bring their own structures to the encounter, and that the processed version is what we mean by reality in our lived experience. The Mandela effect sits at the intersection of these two positions in a way that makes both visible. The realist position is vindicated by the archive. The books exist and their spines can be read and the name is what it is and the record is accurate. The constructivist position is vindicated by the experience. The collective memory is real as a social and cognitive phenomenon. The shared false certainty is a feature of the cultural reality that the community has constructed around the source material. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. The truth that nobody owns is not the truth that is merely contested, where different parties have different interests and different accounts, and the question is which account will prevail. It is the truth that is genuinely distributed, that exists partly in the archive, and partly in the mind, and partly in the social interaction between minds, and partly in the interaction between minds and archive, and that cannot be fully located in any one of these places without losing something real that is in the others. The specific facts of the Berenstain Bears name are in the archive. The meaning of the Berenstain Bears for the people who grew up with them is in the collective memory. The archive can correct the memory on the specific fact. The memory cannot be corrected on the meaning without something being lost that the archive cannot replace. What the Mandela effect has done across the decades since the phenomenon was named is make visible the gap between these two kinds of truth, the archive truth and the memory truth. the truth that can be verified and the truth that is lived. They are both real and they are not always the same. The discovery that they diverge is unsettling in a specific way, because the assumption that they converge, that the lived truth and the verifiable truth are the same truth, is one of the foundations of the ordinary confidence with which we move through the world. The E was never there. The E is in thousands of childhoods. The archive says the first, the memory says the second. Reality contains both, and nobody owns. Chapter 25. The feeling of almost remembering. There is a moment that arrives without being summoned. You are in the middle of something ordinary, not searching for anything, not attempting to remember, and something reaches you from a direction you were not expecting. A smell, perhaps, or a quality of afternoon light, or a particular combination of sounds that your nervous system recognizes before your mind does. And for a moment, there is something just ahead, something that feels like it is about to arrive, a memory that is present but not quite accessible, hovering in that specific place between knowing and not knowing that has no comfortable name. You reach for it. The reaching is the wrong motion. The reaching pushes it further. You try not to reach. The trying is also the wrong motion. The thing that was almost there retreats, not completely, but enough that what remains is only the awareness that something was there, the outline of something that you cannot fill in, the specific ache of a thing that is yours but that you cannot hold. This experience has a name in the psychology of memory. It is called the tip of the tongue state, and it is among the most studied phenomena in the field. What is happening, according to the research, is that the cue has successfully activated some of the retrieval pathways associated with the target memory, but has not activated all of them. Enough has been activated to produce the strong sense of knowing that the memory exists and that it is available, but not enough to produce the full reconstruction that would make the memory accessible. The feeling is accurate in one way and misleading in another. Accurate in that the memory exists and is stored. Misleading in that the feeling of imminence, the sense that it is about to come, is not a reliable indicator of whether it will in fact come. Sometimes it does come, often in a moment when the deliberate effort to retrieve it has been abandoned, often it does not. But the Mandela Effect series has not been primarily about the tip of the tongue state. It has been about a different, and in some ways more troubling relationship between memory and its objects. Not the memory that is real but temporarily inaccessible. The memory that is real but wrong. The memory that is present and certain and retrievable and incorrect. The thing you almost remember in the tip of the tongue state is genuinely there. The thing you remember with complete confidence in the Mandela Effect case may not have existed in the form you remember it. The feeling of almost remembering in the context of this series is something slightly different from the tip of the tongue state, though related to it. It is the feeling that arises when you are told that the thing you remember was not the way you remember it, and you try to find the correct version in your own memory and cannot. The correct version is not there. What is there is the E, the monocle, the dead man who is not dead. The version that the archive confirms is absent from your personal record, or present only in the abstract, as a statement of fact that you have now been told and that you can repeat, but that does not feel like a memory in the way that the incorrect version feels like a memory. You know that the A was always there. You do not remember the A in the way that you remember the E. This asymmetry is one of the most striking features of the Mandela Effect experience and one of the least discussed. The correct information, once provided, is often stored as a fact rather than as a memory. The incorrect information remains available as a memory, with the texture and the warmth and the specific phenomenological quality that memories have and that facts do not. You know the A is correct. You remember the E. The knowing and the remembering are different kinds of cognitive events, and they feel different from the inside, and the Mandela Effect sits in the gap between them in a way that is not resolved by being told the correct fact. The specific comfort of almost remembering that this final chapter is about is not the comfort of the tip of the tongue state resolving, not the memory finally arriving in full. It is the comfort of accepting that the almost remembered version, the version that hovers just out of reach in the form that would match the verifiable record, may not be available. The childhood experience of the Berenstain Bears, as it was actually encoded in the child who read them, as it existed before the schema impositions and the cultural transmission and the reconstructive distortions had accumulated, is not retrievable. What is retrievable is the version that all of that processing produced, which is the E version. The original encoding, if it was the A version, is buried under the subsequent reconstructions. The access point to the childhood is the E, which is the wrong E, which is the only E available. What the series has been building toward, across 25 chapters of paradoxes and experiments and false memories and shared certainties and philosophical puzzles, is something like this. Memory is not a recording of the past. It is a relationship with the past. A relationship that is active and ongoing and that changes both parties. The past as you remember it is not the past as it was. It is the past as you have been in relationship with it, across all the years of reconstruction and retrieval and emotional processing and cultural transmission, and the past as it is in relationship with you, shaping the self that does the remembering and being shaped by the self that the remembering has produced. The version of the world that your memory contains is a version that nobody else contains in exactly the same form. The Berenstain Bears in your memory are your Berenstain Bears, shaped by the specific conditions of your encounter with them, the specific age at which you encountered them, the specific context that gave them their weight, the specific emotional associations that the reconstruction process has attached to them across the years. The E in your memory is the E of that specific relationship. The A in the archive is the A of the specific books that existed in the world, independently of your encounter with them. Both are real. They are not the same thing. The comfort of accepting that some things may have existed in a version of the world you can no longer find your way back to is the comfort of accepting that the relationship with the past is not a relationship with the past as it was, because the past as it was is not accessible. The relationship is with the past as it has become in memory, which is different, and which is also genuinely yours in a way that the archived A is not yours. The archived A belongs to the world. The remembered E belongs to the childhood. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. The feeling of almost remembering is the feeling of this gap, the gap between the world and the memory of the world, which are both real and are not the same, and cannot be made the same by any amount of checking, because the checking is done by the memory, which is looking for a version of itself that it has already changed beyond finding.